Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Context of White Supremacy. If I had the volume a little bit lower, I would have just let that play. Did the introduction to the program. Justice Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, December 14th, 2012. So I have been told. Even that sentence right there, so I have been told, is directly, intrinsically related to 1984, our second study session on George Orwell's incredibly important book. I think for anyone, if you listen to the program and this is your first time reading 1984, I think B. Moore said that she hadn't heard of the book before, which I'm very surprised because this book is so influential and it's talked about. I know it's taught in a lot of schools. I know we didn't read it in school. We read some of his other work, but it's such a widely recognized book. I'm a little surprised that there are folks out there who are not familiar with it, but I think the more that you hear the book as we study, you will recognize certain phrases. It has just had an immense impact on the way people think, the way people talk, especially many of the white people in the ilk of the Obama deception. I can't think of his name. Alex Jones. Yeah. Anyway, I'm very excited to get deeper into the book. I have actually been studying, prepping for this week's session. I had listened to the sessions we're going to study this week. I actually watched the older 1954 version of the film, and I looked at the sections that we're going to discuss this week, and oh man, language comes. Just pay attention. They will get very explicit on words, and you will get a lot more information about the love interest, quote unquote, romantic relationship in the book. That will come front and center. So take notes, pay attention to the colors, pay attention to language and the way that they use language to govern the way people think, what they think about, and how they articulate what it is that they think. All of that will become very clear. Take notes, and hopefully people will dial in to participate. To start things off, I do want to go back and read a little bit more of the Politics and the English Language essay. This is it's awesome. This again was published in 1946, which is just a few years before Orwell published 1984, and you can see the focus is still on how when you have language that is not efficient, it's not clear, it can have a tremendous and deleterious impact on being able to think clearly. And I think he says that if you are in a system where you're being oppressed, you're being mistreated, the number one step before you get to anything else has got to be clarity, understanding, getting rid of the vagueness, and getting to a point where I don't want to continue to say clear, but I mean where you have an accurate, efficient understanding of what the problem is and what you're trying to do to correct that, and where you can articulate that, where you can express that to other people in a manner so that they have total understanding of what it is that you said, where you're not just on the same page, where you're on the same syllable. That is immensely important. You're not going to be able to correct the problem until you get there. And I am like 50,000% certain that non-white people are not there yet. We're not even close. So this is just a bit more from the essay. I'm not sure I'll read the whole thing. It's not very long. I think I read about half of it last week, but I just think it's extremely important. So this is about halfway through the essay, Politics and the English Language. After he's gone through some of the different things that are wrong, metaphors that don't make sense, and just using a lot of muddled phrases and what have you, he goes on to say, now that I have made this catalog of swindles and perversions, let me give another example of the kind of writing that they lead to. This time it must of its nature be an imaginary one. I'm going to translate a passage of good English into modern English of the worst sort. Here is a well-known verse from Ecclesiastes. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Here it is in modern English. Objective considerations of contemporary phenomena compel the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. This is a parody, but not a very gross one. Exhibit 3 above, for instance, contains several patches of the same kind of English. It will be seen that I have not made a full translation. The beginning and end of the sentence followed the original meaning fairly closely, but in the middle, the concrete illustrations, race, battle, bread, dissolve into the vague phrases, success or failure in competitive activities. This had to be so because no modern writer of the kind I am discussing, no one capable of using phrases like objective considerations of contemporary phenomena, would ever tabulate his thoughts in that precise and detailed way. The whole tendency of modern prose is away from concreteness. Now analyze these two sentences a little more closely. The first contains 49 words, but only 60 syllables, and all its words are those of everyday life. The second contains 38 words of 90 syllables. 18 of the words are from Latin roots and 1 from Greek. The first sentence contains 6 vivid images and only 1 phrase, time and chance, that could be called vague. The second contains not a single, fresh, arresting phrase, and in spite of its 90 syllables, it gives only a shortened version of the meaning contained in the first. Yet without a doubt, it is the second kind of sentence that is gaining ground in modern English. I do not want to exaggerate. This kind of writing is not yet universal, and outcrops of simplicity will occur here and there in the worst written page. Still, if you or I were told to write a few lines on the uncertainty of human fortunes, we should probably come much nearer to my imaginary sentence than to the one from Ecclesiastes. As I have tried to show, modern writing, at its its worst does not consist in picking out words for the sake of their meaning and inventing images in order to make the meaning clearer. It consists in gumming together long strips of words which have already been set in order by someone else and making the results presentable by sheer humbug. The attraction of this way of writing is that it is easy. It is easier, even quicker, once you have the habit, to say, in my opinion, it is not an unjustifiable assumption than to say, I think. If you use ready-made phrases, you not only don't have to hunt about for the words, you also don't have to bother with the rhymes of your sentences, since these phrases are generally so arranged as to be more or less euphonious. When you are composing in a hurry, when you are dictating to a stenographer, for instance, or making a public speech, it is natural to fall into pretentious, Latinized styles. Tags like a consideration which we should do well to bear in mind, or a conclusion to which all of us would readily assent, will save many a sentence from coming down with a bump. By using stale metaphors, similes, and idioms, you save much mental effort at the cost of leaving your meaning vague, not only for your reader, but for yourself. This is the significance of mixed metaphors. The sole aim of a metaphor is to call up a visual image. When these images clash, as in the fascist octopus has sung its swan song, the jackboot is thrown into the melting pot, it can be taken as certain that the writer is not seeing a mental image of the objects he is naming. In other words, he is not really thinking. Look again at the examples I gave at the beginning of this essay. Professor Lasky, first example, uses 5 negatives in 53 words. One of these is superfluous, making nonsense of the whole passage, and in addition there is the slip, alien for akin, making further nonsense, and several avoidable pieces of clumsiness which increase the general vagueness. Professor Hogben, in example 2, plays ducks and drakes with a battery which is able to write prescriptions, and while disapproving of the everyday phrase put up with, is unwilling to look egregious up in the dictionary and see what it means. If one takes an uncharitable attitude towards it, is simply meaningless. Probably one could work out its intended meaning by reading the whole of the article in which it occurs. In the 4th example, the writer knows more or less what he wants to say, but an accumulation of stale phrases chokes him like tea leaves blocking a sink. In the 5th example, words and meanings have almost parted company. People who write in this manner usually have a general emotional meaning. They dislike one thing and want to express solidarity with another, but they are not interested in the detail of what they are saying. A scrupulous writer, in every sentence that he writes, will ask himself at least 4 questions. Thus, what am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image or idiom will make it clearer? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? And she will probably ask herself two more. Could I put it more shortly? Have I said anything that is avoidably ugly? But you are not obliged to go to all this trouble. You can shirk it simply by throwing your mind open and letting the ready-made phrases come crowding in. They will construct your sentences for you, even think your thoughts for you to a certain extent. And at need, they will perform the important service of partially concealing your meaning, even from yourself. It is at this point that the special connection between politics and the debasement of language becomes clear. In our time, it is broadly true that political writing is bad writing. Were it not true, it will generally be found that the writer is some kind of rebel expressing his private opinions and not a quote-unquote party line. Orthodoxy of whatever color seems to demand a lifeless, imitative style. The political dialects to be found in pamphlets, leading articles, manifestos, white papers, and the speeches of undersecretaries do, of course, vary from party to party, but they are all alike in that one almost never finds in them a fresh, vivid, homemade turn of speech. When one watches some tired hack on the platform mechanically repeating the familiar phrases, bestial, atrocities, iron heel, blood-stained tyranny, free peoples of the world, stand shoulder to shoulder, one often has a curious feeling that one is not watching a live human being, but some kind of dummy, a feeling which suddenly becomes stronger at moments when the light catches the speaker's spectacles and turns them into blank discs which seem to have no eyes behind them. And this is not altogether fanciful. A speaker who uses that kind of phraseology has gone some distance towards turning himself into a machine. The appropriate noises are coming out of his larynx, but his brain is not involved, as it would be if he were choosing his words for himself. If the speech he is making is one that he is accustomed to make over and over again, he may be almost unconscious of what he is saying, as one is when one utters the responses in church. And this reduced state of consciousness, if not indispensable, is at any rate favorable to political conformity. In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Things like the continuance of British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations, the dropping of the atom bombs on Japan can indeed be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face and which do not square with the professed aims of the political parties. Thus, political language has to consist largely of euphemisms, question-begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine-gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than can carry. This is called transfer of population, or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial, or shot in the back of the neck, or sent to die of scurvy in Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. Consider, for instance, some comfortable English professor defending Russian totalitarianism. He cannot say outright, "I believe in killing off your opponents when you can get good results by doing so." Probably, therefore, he will say something like this: while freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods, and that the rigors which the Russian people have been called upon to undergo have been amply justified in the sphere of concrete achievement. The inflated style itself is kind of euphemism. A mass of Latin words falls upon the facts like soft snow, blurring the outline and covering up all the details. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. I will stop right there. Man, you should just read the rest of the essay. It is incredible, and I think everything he just said, it should call to mind so many of the times when you hear white people, pretty much when you hear white people talk about anything. I will just repeat that one short sentence. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. And because, in my view, white people are white supremacists, that's what it means to be white, because they are dedicated to racism, white supremacy, and in many instances, they are just on default. They are pretty much going to be insincere when they are talking about anything. Because you can't just come out and be blunt, at least for most white people. You can't just come out and be blunt and say, yeah, I believe in having my foot on these niggers' necks or ever. So they're going to be insincere about whatever they're talking about, and that's why you do not get clarity. That's why you get buckets and buckets of words. That's why you get all these long, drawn-out responses that take 5 hours, and you still aren't sure what they've said. That is why. Phenomenal essay. I would again just encourage folks to check it out, and the book pretty much will be talking about this a lot this week, because they will get into more detail about newspeak and thinning down the dictionary. With that, we will get to the second installment. I hope it has been clear. I hope it has been clear for the folks listening in, and we'll get to the second installment and get to the phone line once we finish up with this. So this is George Orwell, 1984. I guess actually this would be the third installment. First audio session, but third installment of the book so far. George Orwell's 1984.
1984, Cassette 2.
Chapter 5. In the low-ceilinged canteen deep underground, the lunch queue jerked slowly forward. The room was already very full and deafeningly noisy. From the grill at the counter the steam of stew came pouring forth with a sour metallic smell which did not quite overcome the fumes of Victory gin. On the far side of the room there was a small bar, a mere hole in the wall where gin could be bought at 10 cents the large nip. "Just the man I was looking for," said a voice at Winston's back. He turned round. It was his friend Syme, who worked in the research department. Perhaps friend was not exactly the right word. You did not have friends nowadays, you had comrades. But there were some comrades whose society was pleasanter than that of others. Syme was a philologist, a specialist in newspeak. Indeed, he was one of the enormous team of experts now engaged in compiling the 11th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary. He was a tiny creature, smaller than Winston, with dark hair and large, protuberant eyes, at once mournful and derisive, which seemed to search your face closely while he was speaking to you. "I wanted to ask whether you'd got any razor blades," he said. "Not one," said Winston, with a sort of guilty haste. "I've tried all over the place. They don't exist any longer." Everyone kept asking you for razor blades. Actually, he had 2 unused ones which he was hoarding up. There had been a famine of them for months past. At any given moment there was some necessary article which the party shops were unable to supply. Sometimes it was buttons, sometimes it was darning wool, sometimes it was shoelaces. At present it was razor blades. You could only get hold of them, if at all, by scrounging more or less furtively on the free market. "I've been using the same blade for 6 weeks, he added untruthfully. The queue gave another jerk forward. As they halted, he turned and faced Syme again. Each of them took a greasy metal tray from a pile at the edge of the counter. "Did you go and see the prisoners hanged yesterday?" said Syme. "I was working," said Winston indifferently. "I shall see it on the flicks, I suppose." "A very inadequate substitute," said Syme. His mocking eyes roved over Winston's face. "I know you," the eyes seemed to say. "I see through you. I know very well why you didn't go to see those prisoners hanged." In an intellectual way, Syme was venomously orthodox. He would talk with a disagreeable, gloating satisfaction of helicopter raids on enemy villages, the trial and confessions of thought criminals, the executions in the cellars of the Ministry of Love. Talking to him was largely a matter of getting him away from such subjects and entangling him, if possible, in the technicalities of newspeak, on which he was authoritative and interesting. Winston turned his head a little aside to avoid the scrutiny of the large dark eyes. "It was a good hanging," said Syme reminiscently. "I think it spoils it when they tie their feet together. I like to see them kicking. And above all, at the end, the tongue sticking right out and blue, a quite bright blue. That's the detail that appeals to me." "Next, please," yelled the white-aproned prole with the ladle. Winston and Syme pushed their trays beneath the grill. Onto each was dumped swiftly the regulation lunch: metal pannikin of pinkish-grey stew, a hunk of bread, a cube of cheese, a mug of milkless Victory coffee, and 1 saccharin tablet. "There's a table over there under that telescreen," said Syme. "Let's pick up a gin on the way." The gin was served out to them in handle-less china mugs. They threaded their way across the crowded room and unpacked their trays onto the metal-top table, on one corner of which someone had left a pool of stew, a filthy liquid mess that had the appearance of vomit. Winston took up his mug of gin, paused for an instant to collect his nerve, and gulped the oily-tasting stuff down. When he had winked the tears out of his eyes, he suddenly discovered that he was hungry. He began swallowing spoonfuls of the stew, which, in among its general sloppiness, had cubes of spongy, pinkish stuff which was probably a preparation of meat. Neither of them spoke again until they had emptied their pannikins. From the table at Winston's left, a little behind his back, someone was talking rapidly and continuously, a harsh gabble almost like the quacking of a duck, which pierced the general uproar of the room. "How's the dictionary getting on?" said Winston, raising his voice to overcome the noise. "Slowly," said Syme. "I'm on the adjectives. It's fascinating." He had brightened up immediately at the mention of newspeak. He pushed his pannikin aside, took up his hunk of bread in one delicate hand and his cheese in the other, and leaned across the table so as to be able to speak without shouting. "The 11th edition is the definitive edition," he said. "We're getting the language into its final shape, the shape it's going to have when nobody speaks anything else. When we've finished with it, people like you will have to learn it all over again. You think, I dare say, that our chief job is inventing new words, but not a bit of it. We're destroying words, scores of them, hundreds of them, every day. We're cutting the language down to the bone. The 11th edition won't contain a single word that will become obsolete before the year 2050. He bit hungrily into his bread and swallowed a couple of mouthfuls, then continued speaking with a sort of pedant's passion. His thin, dark face had become animated. His eyes had lost their mocking expression and grown almost dreamy. "It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. Of course, the great wastage is in the verbs and adjectives, but there are hundreds of nouns that can be got rid of as well. It isn't only the synonyms. There are also the antonyms. After all, what justification is there for a word which is simply the opposite of some other words? A word contains its opposite in itself. Take good, for instance. If you have a word like good, what need is there for a word like bad? Ungood will do just as well. Better, because it's an exact opposite, which the other is not. Or, again, if you want a stronger version of good, what sense is there in having a whole string of vague, useless words like excellent and splendid and all the rest of them? Plus good covers the meaning. Or double plus good if you want something stronger still. Of course, we use those forms already, but in the final version of Newspeak there'll be nothing else. In the end, the whole notion of goodness and badness will be covered by only 6 words. In reality, only 1 word. Don't you see the beauty of that, Winston? It was BB's idea originally, of course, he added as an afterthought. A sort of vapid eagerness flitted across Winston's face at the mention of Big Brother. Nevertheless, Syme immediately detected a certain lack of enthusiasm. "You haven't a real appreciation of Newspeak, Winston," he said almost sadly. "Even when you write it, you're still thinking in old speak. I've read some of those pieces that you write in the Times occasionally. They're good enough, but they're translations. In your heart, you'd prefer to stick to old speak with all its vagueness and its useless shades of meaning. You don't grasp the beauty of the destruction of words. Do you know that Newspeak is the only language in the world whose vocabulary gets smaller every year?" Winston did know that, of course. He smiled sympathetically, he hoped, not trusting himself to speak. Syme bit off another fragment of the dark-coloured bread, chewed it briefly, and went on. "Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that will ever be needed will be expressed by exactly 1 word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Already in the 11th edition we're not far from that point. But the process will still be continuing long after you and I are dead. Every year fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Even now, of course, there's no reason or excuse for committing thought crime. It's merely a question of self-discipline, reality control. But in the end there won't be any need even for that. The revolution will be complete when the language is perfect. Newspeak is Ingsoc, and Ingsoc is Newspeak," he added with a sort of mystical satisfaction. "Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050 at the very latest, not a single human being will be alive who could understand such a conversation as we are having now?" "Except," began Winston doubtfully, and then stopped. It had been on the tip of his tongue to say, "except the proles," but he checked himself, not feeling fully certain that this remark was not in some way unorthodox. Syme, however, had divined what he was about to say. "The proles are not human beings," he said carelessly. "By 2050, earlier probably, all real knowledge of Old Speak will have disappeared. The whole literature of the past will have been destroyed. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron. They'll exist only in Newspeak versions. Not merely changed into something different, but actually changed into something contradictory of what they used to be. Even the literature of the party will change. Even the slogans will change. How could you have a slogan like 'Freedom is slavery' when the concept of freedom has been abolished? The whole climate of thought will be different. In fact, there will be no thought as we understand it now. Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness." "One of these days," thought Winston with sudden, deep conviction, "Syme will be vaporized. He is too intelligent. He sees too clearly and speaks too plainly. The party does not like such people. One day he will disappear. It is written in his face." Winston had finished his bread and cheese. He turned a little sideways in his chair to drink his mug of coffee. At the table on his left, the man with the strident voice was still talking remorselessly away. A young woman who was perhaps his secretary and who was sitting with her back to Winston was listening to him and seemed to be eagerly agreeing with everything that he said. From time to time Winston caught some such remark as, "I think you're so right, I do so agree with you," uttered in a youthful and rather silly feminine voice. But the other voice never stopped for an instant, even when the girl was speaking. Winston knew the man by sight, though he knew no more about him than that he held some important post in the fiction department. He was a man of about 30, with a muscular throat and a large, mobile mouth. His head was thrown back a little, and because of the angle at which he was sitting, his spectacles caught the light and presented to Winston two blank discs instead of eyes. What was slightly horrible was that from the stream of sound that poured out of his mouth it was almost impossible to distinguish a single word. Just once Winston caught a phrase, complete and final elimination of Goldsteinism, jerked out very rapidly, and as it seemed all in one piece, like a line of type cast solid. For the rest it was just a noise, a quack, quack, quacking. And yet, though you could not actually hear what the man was saying, you could not be in any doubts about its general nature. He might be denouncing Goldstein and demanding sterner measures against thought criminals and saboteurs. He might be fulminating against the atrocities of the Eurasian army. He might be praising Big Brother or the heroes on the Malabar front. It made no difference. Whatever it was, you could be certain that every word of it was pure orthodoxy, pure ingsoc. As he watched the eyeless face with the jaw moving rapidly up and down, Winston had a curious feeling that this was not a real human being, but some kind of dummy. It was not the man's brain that was speaking, it was his larynx. The stuff that was coming out of him consisted of words, but it was not speech in the true sense. It was a noise uttered in unconsciousness, like the quacking of a duck. Syme had fallen silent for a moment, and with the handle of his spoon was tracing patterns in the puddle of stew. The voice from the other table quacked rapidly on, easily audible in spite of the surrounding din. "There is a word in newspeak," said Syme. "I don't know whether you know it. Duck-speak, to quack like a duck. It is one of those interesting words that have two contradictory meanings. Applied to an opponent, it is abuse. Applied to someone you agree with, it is praise." Unquestionably Syme will be vaporized, Winston thought again. He thought it with a kind of sadness, although well knowing that Syme despised him and slightly disliked him, and was fully capable of denouncing him as a thought criminal if he saw any reason for doing so. There was something subtly wrong with Syme. There was something that he lacked. Discretion, aloofness, a sort of saving stupidity. You could not say that he was unorthodox. He believed in the principles of ingsoc. He venerated Big Brother. He rejoiced over victories. He hated heretics, not merely with sincerity, but with a sort of restless zeal, an up-to-dateness of information which the ordinary party member did not approach. Yet a faint air of disreputability always clung to him. He said things that would have been better unsaid. He had read too many books. He frequented the Chestnut Tree Café, haunt of painters and musicians. There was no law, not even an unwritten law, against frequenting the Chestnut Tree Café, yet the place was somehow ill-omened. The old, discredited leaders of the party had been used to gather there before they were finally purged. Goldstein himself, it was said, had sometimes been seen there years and decades ago. Syme's fate was not difficult to foresee. And yet it was a fact that if Syme grasped, even for 3 seconds, the nature of his, Winston's, secret opinions, he would betray him instantly to the thought police. So would anybody else, for that matter, but Syme more than most. Zeal was not enough. Orthodoxy was unconsciousness. Syme looked up. "Here comes Parsons," he said. Something in the tone of his voice seemed to add, "that bloody fool." Parsons, Winston's fellow tenant at Victory Mansions, was in fact threading his way across the room, a tubby, middle-sized man with fair hair and a frog-like face. At 35 he was already putting on rolls of fat at neck and waistline, but his movements were brisk and boyish. His whole appearance was that of a little boy grown large, so much so that although he was wearing the regulation overalls, it was almost impossible not to think of him as being dressed in the blue shorts, grey shirt, and red neckerchief of the spies. In visualizing him, one always saw a picture of dimpled knees and sleeves rolled back from pudgy forearms. Parsons did, indeed, invariably revert to shorts when a community hike or any other physical activity gave him an excuse for doing so. He greeted them both with a cheery "hello, hello," and sat down at the table, giving off an intense smell of sweat. Beads of moisture stood out all over his pink face. His powers of sweating were extraordinary. At the community center you could always tell when he had been playing table tennis by the dampness of the bat handle. Syme had produced a strip of paper on which there was a long column of words and was studying it with an ink pencil between his fingers. "Look at him working away in the lunch hour," said Parsons, nudging Winston. "Keen this, eh? What's that you've got there, old boy? Something a bit too brainy for me, I expect." Smith, old boy, I tell you why I'm chasing you. It's that sub you forgot to give me." "Which sub is that?" said Winston, automatically feeling for money. About a quarter of one's salary had to be earmarked for voluntary subscriptions, which were so numerous that it was difficult to keep track of them. "For Hate Week. You know, the house-by-house fund. I'm treasurer for our block. We're making an all-out effort. Going to put on a tremendous show. I tell you, it won't be my fault if old Victory Mansions doesn't have the biggest outfit of flags in the whole street. $2 you promised me." Winston found and handed over 2 creased and filthy notes, which Parsons entered in a small notebook in the neat handwriting of the illiterate. "By the way, old boy," he said, "I hear that little beggar of mine let fly at you with his catapult yesterday. I gave him a good dressing down for it. In fact, I told him I'd take the catapult away if he does it again." "I think he was a little upset at not going to the execution," said Winston. "Oh, well, what I mean to say shows the right spirit, doesn't it? Mischievous little beggars they are, both of them, but talk about keenness. All they think about is the spies, and the war, of course. Do you know what that little girl of mine did last Saturday when her troop was on a hike out Berkhamsted way? She got 2 other girls to go with her, slipped off from the hike, and spent the whole afternoon following a strange man. They kept on his tail for 2 hours right through the woods, and then when they got into Amersham, handed him over to the patrols." "What did they do that for?" said Winston, somewhat taken aback. Parsons went on triumphantly. "My kid made sure he was some kind of enemy agent. Might have been dropped by parachute, for instance. But here's the point, old boy. What do you think put her onto him in the first place? She spotted he was wearing a funny kind of shoes. Said she'd never seen anyone wearing shoes like that before, so the chances were he was a foreigner. Pretty smart for a nipper of 7, eh?" "What happened to the man?" said Winston. "Oh, that I couldn't say, of course, but I wouldn't be altogether surprised if—" Parsons made the motion of aiming a rifle and clicked his tongue for the explosion. "Good," said Syme abstractedly, without looking up from his strip of paper. "Of course, we can't afford to take chances," agreed Winston dutifully. "What I mean to say, there's a war on," said Parsons. As though in confirmation of this, a trumpet call floated from the telescreen just above their heads. However, it was not the proclamation of a military victory this time, but merely an announcement from the Ministry of Plenty. "Comrades!" cried an eager, youthful voice. "Attention, comrades! We have glorious news for you. We have won the battle for production. Returns now completed of the output of all classes of consumption goods show that the standard of living has risen by no less than 20% over the past year. All over Oceania this morning there were irrepressible, spontaneous demonstrations when workers marched out of factories and offices and paraded through the streets with banners voicing their gratitude to Big Brother for the new, happy life which his wise leadership has bestowed upon us. Here are some of the completed figures. Foodstuffs—" The phrase, "our new, happy life," recurred several times. It had been a favorite of late with the Ministry of Plenty. Parsons, his attention caught by the trumpet call, sat listening with a sort of gaping solemnity, a sort of edified boredom. He could not follow the figures, but he was aware that they were in some way a cause for satisfaction. He had lugged out a huge and filthy pipe, which was already half full of charred tobacco. With the tobacco ration at 100 grams a week, it was seldom possible to fill a pipe up to the top. Winston was smoking a Victory cigarette, which he held carefully horizontal. The new ration did not start until tomorrow, and he had only 4 cigarettes left. For the moment he had shut his ears to the remoter noises and was listening to the stuff that streamed out of the telescreen. It appeared that there had even been demonstrations to thank Big Brother for raising the chocolate ration to 20 grams a week. And only yesterday, he reflected, it had been announced that the ration was to be reduced to 20 grams a week. Was it possible that they could swallow that after only 24 hours? Yes, they swallowed it. Parsons swallowed it easily, with the stupidity of an animal. The eyeless creature at the other table swallowed it fanatically, passionately, with a furious desire to track down, denounce, and vaporize anyone who should suggest that last week the ration had been 30 grams. Syme, too, in some more complex way involving doublethink, Syme swallowed it. Was he then alone in the possession of a memory? The fabulous statistics continued to pour out of the telescreen. As compared with last year, there was more food, more clothes, more houses, more furniture, more cooking pots, more fuel, more ships, more helicopters, more books, more babies, more of everything except disease, crime, and insanity. Year by year and minute by minute, everybody and everything was whizzing rapidly upwards. As Syme had done earlier, Winston had taken up his spoon and was dabbling in the pale-coloured gravy that dribbled across the table, drawing a long streak of it out into a pattern. He meditated resentfully on the physical texture of life. Had it always been like this? Had food always tasted like this? He looked around the canteen. A low-ceilinged, crowded room, its walls grimy from the contact of innumerable bodies, battered metal tables and chairs placed so close together that you sat with elbows touching, bent spoons, dented trays, coarse white mugs, all surfaces greasy, grime in every crack, and a sourish composite smell of bad gin and bad coffee and metallic stew and dirty clothes. Always in your stomach and in your skin there was a sort of protest, a feeling that you had been cheated of something that you had a right to. It was true that he had no memories of anything greatly different. In any time that he could accurately remember, there had never been quite enough to eat. One never had socks or underclothes that were not full of holes. Furniture had always been battered and rickety, rooms underheated, tube trains crowded, houses falling to pieces, bread dark-coloured, tea a rarity, coffee filthy tasting, cigarettes insufficient, nothing cheap and plentiful except synthetic gin. And though, of course, it grew worse as one's body aged, was it not a sign that this was not the natural order of things if one's heart sickened at the discomfort and dirt and scarcity, the interminable winters, the stickiness of one's socks, the lifts that never worked, the cold water, the gritty soap, the cigarettes that came to pieces, the food with its strange evil tastes? Why should one feel it to be intolerable unless one had some kind of ancestral memory that things had once been different? He looked round the canteen again. Nearly everyone was ugly, and would still have been ugly even if dressed otherwise than in the uniform blue overalls. On the far side of the room, sitting at a table alone, a small, curiously beetle-like man was drinking a cup of coffee, his little eyes darting suspicious glances from side to side. How easy it was, thought Winston, if you did not look about you, to believe that the physical type set up by the party as an ideal, tall, muscular youths and deep-bosomed maidens, blonde-haired, vital, sunburnt, carefree, existed and even predominated. Actually, so far as he could judge, the majority of people in Airstrip 1 were small, dark, and ill-favoured. It was curious how that beetle-like type proliferated in the ministries. Little dumpy men, growing stout very early in life, with short legs, swift scuttling movements, and fat, inscrutable faces with very small eyes. It was the type that seemed to flourish best under the dominion of the party. The announcement from the Ministry of Plenty ended on another trumpet call and gave way to tinny music. Parsons, stirred to vague enthusiasm by the bombardment of figures, took his pipe out of his mouth. "The Ministry of Plenty's certainly done a good job this year," he said with a knowing shake of his head. "By the way, Smith, old boy, I suppose you haven't got any razor blades you can let me have?" "Not one," said Winston. "I've been using the same blade for 6 weeks myself." "Ah, well, just thought I'd ask you, old boy." "Sorry," said Winston. The quacking voice from the next table, temporarily silenced during the ministry's announcement, had started up again, as loud as ever. For some reason, Winston suddenly found himself thinking of Mrs. Parsons, with her wispy hair and the dust in the creases of her face. Within 2 years, those children would be denouncing her to the thought police. Mrs. Parsons would be vaporized. Syme would be vaporized. Winston would be vaporized. O'Brien would be vaporized. Parsons, on the other hand, would never be vaporized. The eyeless creature with the quacking voice would never be vaporized. The little beetle-like men who scuttled so nimbly through the labyrinthine corridors of ministries, they too would never be vaporized. And the girl with dark hair, the girl from the fiction department, she would never be vaporized either. It seemed to him that he knew instinctively who would survive and who would perish, though what it was that made for survival, it was not easy to say. At this moment he was dragged out of his reverie with a violent jerk. The girl at the next table had turned partly round and was looking at him. It was the girl with dark hair. She was looking at him in a sidelong way, but with curious intensity. The instant that she caught his eye, she looked away again. The sweat started out on Winston's backbone. A horrible pang of terror went through him. It was gone almost at once, but it left a sort of nagging uneasiness behind. Why was she watching him? Why did she keep following him about? Unfortunately, he could not remember whether she had already been at the table when he arrived, or had come there afterwards. But yesterday, at any rate, during the 2 minutes' hate, she had sat immediately behind him when there was no apparent need to do so. Quite likely her real object had been to listen to him and make sure whether he was shouting loudly enough. His earlier thought returned to him. Probably she was not actually a member of the thought police. But then it was precisely the amateur spy who was the greatest danger of all. He did not know how long she had been looking at him, but perhaps for as much as 5 minutes, and it was possible that his features had not been perfectly under control. It was terribly dangerous to let your thoughts wander when you were in any public place or within range of a telescreen. The smallest thing could give you away. A nervous tic, an unconscious look of anxiety, a habit of muttering to yourself, anything that carried with it the suggestion of abnormality, of having something to hide. In any case, to wear an improper expression on your face, to look incredulous when a victory was announced, for example, was itself a punishable offence. There was even a word for it in newspeak. Face crime, it was called. The girl had turned her back on him again. Perhaps, after all, she was not really following him about. Perhaps it was coincidence that she had sat so close to him 2 days running. His cigarette had gone out, and he laid it carefully on the edge of the table. He would finish smoking it after work if he could keep the tobacco in it. Quite likely the person at the next table was a spy of the thought police. And quite likely he would be in the cellars of the Ministry of Love within 3 days, but a cigarette end must not be wasted. Syme had folded up his strip of paper and stowed it away in his pocket. Parsons had begun talking again. "Did I ever tell you, old boy," he said, chuckling around the stem of his pipe, "about the time when those 2 nippers of mine set fire to the old market woman's skirt because they saw her wrapping up sausages in a poster of BB? Sneaked up behind her and set fire to it with a box of matches. Burned her quite badly, I believe, little beggars, eh? But keen as mustard. That's first-rate training they give 'em in the spies nowadays, better than in my day, even. What do you think's the latest thing they've served 'em out with? Ear trumpets, for listening through keyholes. My little girl brought one home the other night, tried it out on our sitting-room door, and reckoned she could hear twice as much as with her ear to the hole. Of course, it's only a toy, mind you. Still gives them the right idea, huh?" At this moment the telescreen let out a piercing whistle. It was the signal to return to work. All 3 men sprang to their feet to join in the struggle round the lifts, and the remaining tobacco fell out of Winston's cigarette. Chapter 6. Winston was writing in his diary. It was 3 years ago. It was on a dark evening in a narrow side street near one of the big railway stations. She was standing near a doorway in the wall, under a street lamp that hardly gave any light. She had a young face, painted very thick. It was really the paint that appealed to me, the whiteness of it, like a mask, and the bright red lips. Party women never paint their faces. There was nobody else in the street, and no telescreens. She said $2. For the moment it was too difficult to go on. He shut his eyes and pressed his fingers against them, trying to squeeze out the vision that kept recurring. He had an almost overwhelming temptation to shout a string of filthy words at the top of his voice, or to bang his head against the wall, to kick over the table and hurl the inkpot through the window, to do any violent or noisy or painful thing that might black out the memory that was still tormenting him. Your worst enemy, he reflected, was your own nervous system. At any moment the tension inside you was liable to translate itself into some visible symptom. He thought of a man whom he had passed in the street a few weeks back. A quite ordinary-looking man, a party member, aged 35 or 40, tallish and thin, carrying a briefcase. They were a few meters apart, when the left side of the man's face was suddenly contorted by a sort of a spasm. It happened again just as they were passing one another. It was only a twitch, a quiver, rapid as the clicking of a camera shutter, but obviously habitual. He remembered thinking at the time, that poor devil is done for. And what was frightening was that the action was quite possibly unconscious. The most deadly danger of all was talking in your sleep. There was no way of guarding against that so far as he could see. He drew in his breath and went on writing. I went with her through the doorway and across a backyard into a basement kitchen. There was a bed against the wall and a lamp on the table, turned down very low. His teeth were set on edge. He would have liked to spit. Simultaneously with the woman in the basement kitchen, he thought of Catherine, his wife. Winston was married. He had been married, at any rate, probably still was married, for so far as he knew his wife was not dead. He seemed to breathe again the warm, stuffy odour of the basement kitchen, an odour compounded of bugs and dirty clothes and villainous cheap scent, but nevertheless alluring, because no woman of the party ever used scent, or could be imagined as doing so. Only the proles used scent. In his mind the smell of it was inextricably mixed up with fornication. When he had gone with that woman, it had been his first lapse in 2 years or thereabouts. Consorting with prostitutes was forbidden, of course, but it was one of those rules that you could occasionally nerve yourself to break. It was dangerous, but it was not a life-and-death matter. To be caught with a prostitute might mean 5 years in a forced labour camp, not more, if you had committed no other offence. And it was easy enough, provided that you could avoid being caught in the act. The poorer quarters swarmed with women who were ready to sell themselves. Some could even be purchased for a bottle of gin, which the proles were not supposed to drink. Tacitly, the party was even inclined to encourage prostitution, as an outlet for instincts which could not be altogether suppressed. Mere debauchery did not matter very much, so long as it was furtive and joyless, and only involved the women of a submerged and despised class. The unforgivable crime was promiscuity between party members. But though this was one of the crimes that the accused in the great purges invariably confessed to, it was difficult to imagine any such thing actually happening. The aim of the party was not merely to prevent men and women from forming loyalties which it might not be able to control. Its real, undeclared purpose was to remove all pleasure from the sexual act. Not love so much as eroticism was the enemy, inside marriage as well as outside it. All marriages between party members had to be approved by a committee appointed for the purpose, and, though the principle was never clearly stated, permission was always refused if the couple concerned gave the impression of being physically attracted to one another. The only recognized purpose of marriage was to beget children for the service of the party. Sexual intercourse was to be looked on as a slightly disgusting minor operation, like having an enema. This again was never put into plain words, but in an indirect way it was rubbed into every party member from childhood onwards. There were even organizations such as the Junior Anti-Sex League, which advocated complete celibacy for both sexes. All children were to be begotten by artificial insemination, artsem it was called in newspeak, and brought up in public institutions. This, Winston was aware, was not meant altogether seriously, but somehow it fitted in with the general ideology of the party. The party was trying to kill the sex instinct, or if it could not be killed, then to distort it and dirty it. He did not know why this was so, but it seemed natural that it should be so, and so far as the women were concerned, the party's efforts were largely successful. He thought again of Catherine. It must be 9, 10, nearly 11 years since they had parted. He was curious how seldom he thought of her. For days at a time he was capable of forgetting that he had ever been married. They had only been together for about 15 months. The party did not permit divorce, but it rather encouraged separation in cases where there were no children. Catherine was a tall, fair-haired girl, very straight, with splendid movements. She had a bold, aquiline face, a face that one might have called noble until one discovered that there was as nearly as possible nothing behind it. Very early in their married life he had decided, though perhaps it was only that he knew her more intimately than he knew most people, that she had, without exception, the most stupid, vulgar, empty mind that he had ever encountered. She had not a thought in her head that was not a slogan, and there was no imbecility, absolutely none, that she was not capable of swallowing if the party handed it out to her. The human soundtrack, he nicknamed her in his own mind. Yet he could have endured living with her, if it had not been for just one thing: sex. As soon as he touched her, she seemed to wince and stiffen. To embrace her was like embracing a jointed wooden image. And what was strange was that even when she was clasping him against her, he had the feeling that she was simultaneously pushing him away with all her strength. The rigidity of her muscles managed to convey that impression. She would lie there with shut eyes, neither resisting nor cooperating, but submitting. It was extraordinarily embarrassing, and after a while horrible. But even then he could have borne living with her, if it had been agreed that they should remain celibate. But curiously enough, it was Catherine who refused this. They must, she said, produce a child, if they could. So the performance continued to happen once a week, quite regularly, whenever it was not impossible. She used even to remind him of it in the morning as something which had to be done that evening and which must not be forgotten. She had 2 names for it. One was making a baby, and the other was our duty to the party. Yes, she had actually used that phrase. Quite soon he grew to have a feeling of positive dread when the appointed day came round. But luckily no child appeared, and in the end she agreed to give up trying, and soon afterwards they parted. Winston sighed inaudibly. He picked up his pen again and wrote. She threw herself down on the bed, and at once, without any kind of preliminary, in the most coarse, horrible way you can imagine, pulled up her skirt. He saw himself standing there in the dim lamplight with the smell of bugs and cheap scent in his nostrils, and in his heart a feeling of defeat and resentment which even at that moment was mixed up with the thought of Catherine's white body, frozen forever by the hypnotic power of the party. Why did it always have to be like this? Why could he not have a woman of his own instead of these filthy scuffles at intervals of years? But a real love affair was an almost unthinkable event. The women of the party were all alike. Chastity was as deeply ingrained in them as party loyalty. By careful early conditioning, by games and cold water, by the rubbish that was dinned into them at school and in the spies and the youth league, by lectures, parades, songs, slogans, and martial music, the natural feeling had been driven out of them. His reason told him that there must be exceptions, but his heart did not believe it. They were all impregnable as the party intended that they should be. And what he wanted, more even than to be loved, was to break down that wall of virtue, even if it were only once in his whole life. The sexual act, successfully performed, was rebellion. Desire was thought crime. Even to have awakened Catherine, if he could have achieved it, would have been like a seduction, although she was his wife. But the rest of the story had got to be written down. He wrote, I turned up the lamp. When I saw her in the light, after the darkness, the feeble light of the paraffin lamp had seemed very bright. For the first time he could see the woman properly. He had taken a step toward her and then halted, full of lust and terror. He was painfully conscious of the risk he had taken in coming here. It was perfectly possible that the patrols would catch him on the way out. For that matter, they might be waiting outside the door at this moment. If he went away without even doing what he had come here to do, it had got to be written down. It had got to be confessed. What he had suddenly seen in the lamplight was that the woman was old. The paint was plastered so thick on her face that it looked as though it might crack like a cardboard mask. There were streaks of white in her hair, but the truly dreadful detail was that her mouth had fallen a little open, revealing nothing except a cavernous blackness. She had no teeth at all. He wrote hurriedly in scrabbling handwriting, When I saw her in the light, she was quite an old woman, 50 years old at least, but I went ahead and did it just the same. He pressed his fingers against his eyelids again. He had written it down at last, but it made no difference. The therapy had not worked. The urge to shout filthy words at the top of his voice was as strong as ever. Chapter 7. If there is hope, wrote Winston, it lies in the proles. If there was hope, it must lie in the proles, because only there, in those swarming, disregarded masses, 85% of the population of Oceania, could the force to destroy the party ever be generated. The party could not be overthrown from within. Its enemies, if it had any enemies, had no way of coming together or even of identifying one another. Even if the legendary Brotherhood existed, as just possibly it might, it was inconceivable that its members could ever assemble in larger numbers than 2s and 3s. Rebellion meant a look in the eyes, an inflection of the voice, at the most an occasional whispered word. But the proles, if only they could somehow become conscious of their own strength, would have no need to conspire. They needed only to rise up and shake themselves like a horse shaking off flies. If they chose, they could blow the party to pieces tomorrow morning. Surely, sooner or later, it must occur to them to do it. And yet, he remembered how once he had been walking down a crowded street when a tremendous shout of hundreds of voices, women's voices, had burst from a side street a little way ahead. It was a great, formidable cry of anger and despair, a deep, loud "ooh" that went humming on like the reverberation of a bell. His heart had leapt. It started, he had thought, a riot. The proles are breaking loose at last. When he had reached the spot, it was to see a mob of 200 or 300 women crowding around the stalls of a street market, with faces as tragic as though they had been the doomed passengers on a sinking ship. But at this moment the general despair broke down into a multitude of individual quarrels. It appeared that one of the stalls had been selling tin saucepans. They were wretched, flimsy things, but cooking pots of any kind were always difficult to get. Now the supply had unexpectedly given out. The successful women, bumped and jostled by the rest, were trying to make off with their saucepans, while dozens of others clamoured round the stall, accusing the stall-keeper of favouritism and of having more saucepans somewhere in reserve. There was a fresh outburst of yells. 2 bloated women, one of them with her hair coming down, had got hold of the same saucepan and were trying to tear it out of one another's hands. For a moment they were both tugging, and then the handle came off. Winston watched them disgustedly. And yet, just for a moment, what almost frightening power had sounded in that cry from only a few hundred throats? Why was it that they could never shout like that about anything that mattered? Until they become conscious, they will never rebel. And until after they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious. That, he reflected, might almost have been a transcription from one of the party textbooks. The party claimed, of course, to have liberated the proles from bondage. Before the revolution they had been hideously oppressed by the capitalists. They had been starved and flogged. Women had been forced to work in the coal mines. Women still did work in the coal mines, as a matter of fact. Children had been sold into the factories at the age of 6. But simultaneously, true to the principles of doublethink, the party taught that the proles were natural inferiors who must be kept in subjection, like animals, by the application of a few simple rules. In reality, very little was known about the proles. It was not necessary to know much. So long as they continued to work and breed, their other activities were without importance. Left to themselves like cattle turned loose upon the plains of Argentina, they had reverted to a style of life that appeared to be natural to them, a sort of ancestral pattern. They were born, they grew up in the gutters, they went to work at 12, they passed through a brief blossoming period of beauty and sexual desire. They married at 20, they were middle-aged at 30, they died for the most part at 60. Heavy physical work, the care of home and children, petty quarrels with neighbours, films, football, beer, and above all, gambling, filled up the horizon of their minds. To keep them in control was not difficult.
This ends side 1 of cassette 2. Please turn the cassette over and start side 2 from the same point.
Context of White Supremacy. As this is a book study session, similar format to a book club, we will encourage folks to dial in, exchange views, what they have thought about the book thus far. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you have questions, thoughts, things you would like to share on the book. The number again is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. I think I was saying last week that there would be more information about the Anti-Sex League and many other aspects of the book. We're still very early, but I think even that section right there should give folks a lot more to ponder on from where we left off last week, and just getting a better idea of what the book is all about. I will hit the phone lines. Let's see. 1804, our caller in Brooklyn, Praz, and Klondike Mike. Your lines should all be open. Any of the other folks who would like to participate, press *6.
Good evening, Gus callers. It's, the New York caller.
Good to hear from you, sir.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for doing the book club. Actually, my attempted brother suggested that I read 1984. He was surprised that I hadn't read it like about 6 months ago, and he suggested 1984 and Animal Farm. So glad to be. It's very, very, very interesting. It's very interesting. It just kind of makes me kind of. It's kind of like the silly, Marimba Ani. It's like just really, really clearly represents the germinating kind of core of a lot of ideas that are out. I think you said that. It's just like you can just really see where a lot of things that are out now, where they came from. Just like it's like I don't know, like there's just not they're not drawing on in the media that we have available to us. We're not drawing on a very large pool of ideas. It's just like very centralized, and that's something that sticks out to me just in just the tone of the book and just the way a lot of the elements of what's going on.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, sir, Praj.
Yeah.
Okay. I was, I was listening to his description of the proles, and like particularly the part where he says, so long as they continue to work and breed, their other activities were without importance, left to themselves like cattle turned loose upon the plains of Argentina. It's kind of like the proles seem to be non-white people, even more specifically black people, because the way that he describes them and sort of saying that if they rebel, then the whole system can come down. And he indicates in a sense that the proles are probably the majority of the population, and that if they rebelled, and you could compare that with the non-white population. There's so many proles that if they decided to uprise, there would be nothing stopping them. But most of them are not conscious, as he said. So I just thought that was an interesting comparison between proles and maybe non-white people.
Great point. I think he says the proles are 85% of the population. As Dr. Wells and many others have said, white people are maybe 10%, maybe even not even 10% of the global population. So I was definitely thinking that exact same thing. The proles, I think, represent non-white people, and I was thinking Winston and the other people who seem to be low-level workers for the party. They have a very hard life. Winston, talking about how grimy and wretched everything is, and how they don't have much of anything. But at least they can look down on the proles and say, "Oh, well, they're not even humans." These beasts who are fighting in the streets over saucepans. At least they can look down on them. It reminded me of the less powerful white people who, hey, I don't have much, I don't have a lot of money or resources or power, but I am white and I can look down on the other niggers. So it definitely, the only thing that stuck out to me that I didn't think was comparable was that I don't think white people just leave black people alone. I think white people invest a lot of time and energy studying in depth black people and what they're doing. They tend not to just toss us to an area and leave us alone. I think that was the only thing that stood out. I said, well, that doesn't, I don't see that match up exactly. White people spend a lot of time studying us, but other than that, I thought it was a great comparison to black people.
Also, I'd like to mention, I don't know if he was talking about his wife or the prostitute he was seeing, but the hatred that the Caucasian men and women have for each other. It just really comes out in his dialogue. It's sort of like chastity is something he wants to destroy, and it just seems like there's always an association with Caucasians with sex and violence. So I definitely could see that, and it goes back to Marimba Ani, the being an incomplete being. So I thought that was also interesting also.
Hello.
Can I be? Oh, sorry.
It's all good. Sorry, I got disconnected a few times in the process of this yearbook club, but I wanted to make a comment about the beginning and the conversation he had about words with Sai, or whatever his name is, and talking about reducing the vocabulary and talking about the level of consciousness that people have based on that vocabulary. And I think this is such a fascinating concept, and it's something that I've been understanding so much more since I started coming onto this show and learning other things about the context, basically learning things I already knew but could never express. And I just wanted to make a couple of comments, and I guess reducing the vocabulary and the consciousness and the way that words are used, it makes me, it reminds me of how I feel sometimes when I'm trying to describe racism, because all the words and our associations with them have all been twisted in a sense. So, for instance, when we talk about racism, like, I now have an understanding where it's like racism and white supremacy are synonymous, right? But most people don't think of that at all and have a completely different idea of what the word racism means, and even just their ideas when they think of black and white and stuff like that, these subconscious ideas, it's like creates this whole consciousness that is like white supremacy. It's fucked up. I'm sorry, excuse, it's messed up. And then I just wanted to make one little anecdote here. I live in a small town in northern Canada, and most of the people I know are white, and I'm actually in the process of moving. I'm trying out some new things here. I'm changing my life, I suppose. But anyways, I still find it necessary myself personally to go out and hang out with individuals, people, other human beings, whether they're white or non-white, and whether they're tacky relationships or not, because I just get extremely lonely. But I wanted to talk about like being at these white people's house a couple of weeks ago, and basically I've just been hanging out with this guy I work with. He's a German guy, and we have these, pretty much we just drink and debate all night, which is really somewhat uncodified, but it's also productive because I get to hear a lot of his truth, and he's very honest. Anyways, I just wanted to bring up one thing that was really funny, and it was basically, I'm sitting on the couch, and I don't even really recall what the conversation was, but my so-called friend is looking up things on Wikipedia, and he's like, "Hey, what's the word for when you kill your daughter?" Basically, and this is interesting because I had heard of the word filicide. I think in some sort of Afrocentric context when they were talking about possibly Yoruba and Iceman concepts and stuff like that. But I was like, filicide? I don't know. And he's like, no, it's more specific than that. And then he starts looking up on Wikipedia, and there's like a whole list of all the different words for killing your family, basically, and stuff like that, or killing, like, different ways of killing. I don't know, it's really messed up. So there's all these really intricate, like, words for killing your daughter, or your kids, or killing your mom, or killing your, killing all these, your family, and then killing yourself. And it's just interesting because I've also had other white people tell me, basically, and not even realize what they're telling me, or realize it, but not realize that I realize, I don't know, but telling me that, one of the reasons why some of the evidence that Africans are so, backwards and really less evolved are their lack of words, certain words that they don't even have in their vocabularies, even though our languages are totally bastardized at this point. But it's just, amazing, because here I am having this, these debates with this guy. It's basically Urugu versus Afro, and here we are, looking up all these English words that have all these specific, very specific words for all these atrocities, and it's well, if that's not revealing, I don't know what is. That's, yeah.
Fascinating. Wow. There was one other caller to join the line, last four digits, 9103. The folks that are listening, if you would like to participate in the discussion, the number again is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943. pound. S. You should be with us as well. I will say that in reading this, it had been a while. I've read this book a couple times. It's been just curiosities. The last time I read this book, I was on the beach in Hawaii during Hurricane Katrina. That was the last time I read this book. But reading it again, this book is incredibly well written. I have an appreciation for people who have some skill with language. This book is very well written. And I mean, it's so clear and so applicable to the system of white supremacy. I hope that that is coming across to people who listen in, and that they are getting something of value out of hearing the book. But S. and 9103, your lines are both open.
Greetings to you, Gus. Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am. Good to hear you, 404.
Thank you. That is one book I have never read. I've never read 1984, Pygmalion, Animal Farm. Those are, even when I was in school, those were not part of the required reading that was on the list for us to read when I was in high school or going through college, and that was many moons ago. But I did see the movie, the 1984, the one with Richard Burton that played in it. I believe that was the one that was made in around 1984, the year when they made that movie. And I've watched it a few times, and at first when I was confused, it kind of went over my head because I'm not a big fan of sci-fi movies. I don't like science fiction movies. So it took me a while to get used to it, and so I watched it a few more times, and that's when I started picking up on the clues as to exactly what is going on with it. And as you were stated with words, I've always found the English language to be very deceptive, which we all know, and now that I'm coming into more consciousness with racism, white supremacy, and a few of the words that you mentioned in that essay, it popped up the page to me, because the word democracy, humanitarian effort, bringing freedom, peace, these are all the opposite of what they are defined as in the White People's English Dictionary. Because whenever they use those four words, you always expect that there's going to be a war that's going to be breaking out somewhere. Because they're always saying, well, we are coming to bring them democracy. They're oppressing women and children. We need to bring aid to them. We need to give them freedom. Freedom of what type of freedom? What form of freedom? Because there's not a one-cut freedom to fit everyone. You are looking at your version of freedom is not going to be the same version based on the cultural dynamics of a different nation who will govern themselves differently. And people get on television all the time, and you keep hearing the news reporters and everyone saying that, we're giving them, we're liberating them, we're doing that to them. Liberating them from what? Because liberation to me, because when I look back and I see the liberation for it, like, for instance, they went into Iraq, and they said they liberated the people. What have they done? There might have been pornography, pedophilia, and all of those, bestiality, all of those going on in all cultures, maybe. But now it's brought up to the forefront. Now you can walk down the street and you can watch pornographic movies. You can watch the gays are more openly walking around doing their thing. When that culture was more in control, when Saddam Hussein had control of that culture over there, these people, they did not dare to expose or do those things. Now the Americans and the Westerners, the white people came in, and they've allowed all of this vermin to flow to the top of the surface, and now people could openly display this type of behavior. The same thing that's going on the continent right now with the legislation that's being pushed, with aid dangling at the tip of it, saying, okay, we're going to restrict giving aid, financial aid or medical aid, unless you accept this sort of agenda, the gay and the lesbian lifestyle and the missionaries to come in and push Christianity and all of these things. You're going to have to allow this to be a part of your culture in order for us to get aid. So it's the very deceptive practice in the way how they put these words together, toss it around. A lot of us who don't take the time to digest and use that third eye of yours to look and see what's being pushed at you, it would float right over your head, because I hear black people saying, oh, they're so backwards, they need all the help that they can get over there, they don't know what they're doing, and need to be civilized. You hear that coming out of the mouth of black people, talking about fellow black people on the African continent, looking at them as being disposable goods. That these people would be better off if white people come up in there and Christianize them and bring them, westernize them, and bring them up to speed to make them look like us. You know, lose concept of your tradition, your tribe, your customs, your sense of belonging, because those people didn't know where they are. They know their history. They can go back centuries. We don't know anything about ourselves. We always keep saying, yeah, we're from Africa, but where in Africa are we from? What tribe are we from? What language did we speak? What would have been the original name instead of these European names that we have tacked on to us? So words are very, very deceptive tools that have been used by the white people, and I believe it was Scott who said that they have changed up the definition for racism now to include everyone bucket, to see that we can all now be racist. Before it was just the white people, which we all know it still applies to them because they maintain they have the power control. But now they are trying to go global and say everybody can be racist if you do what we would term as being maybe prejudiced or being biased towards another person, and it's being classified now as racism.
Yeah, more on 404's point, I mean, definitely I can see the parallels between this book, and I wonder sometimes if they use this book as an instruction manual, because, you know, when they go and invade a country, they'll say, like you said, bring democracy. So what is the first line of the party book? The slogan part is war is peace. So we're going to bring peace to a unstable, savage environment. So war is peace. We're going to bring freedom and democracy, right? Freedom is slavery. And we need people to support us and, you know, not rebel against what we're trying to do, because we're just trying to bring them democracy. And that's ignorance is strength. So, I mean, it's almost like they studied this and had an instruction manual and just like, okay, this is how we're going to control the people. But I mean, it's been going on way before this book was, so I think it's just maybe a refinement.
Yeah.
I think, S. is actually on the line. I wanted to see if he had anything. I also wanted to make sure I tossed in Mr. Orwell, I believe, worked for the BBC. I think just putting things in the proper chronology, he probably had been observing white people do this for a long time. Generally speaking, white people, they figure out strategies that are successful and they just continue to do it as long as it works. So I suspect he probably had been watching white people do these things. He actually was, he has another book, I think it's called Letters from Burma, where he was watching white people go in and stomp on non-white people. So I suspect he was just observing how his fellow white people were getting down in the practice of white supremacy and just applied that to 1984. I suspect that's probably why it's so accurate, but I could be off on that. Although I'm pretty sure he did work for the BBC. S. Did you have something you wanted to contribute?
Yes. I had also saw the movie 1984. I was a lot more confused, and I didn't really pay attention to it. And I watched it a few years later, had a bit of a different perspective on it. And interestingly enough, I have the book 1984, and I didn't even realize I had it on my bookshelf. So just today, I started thumbing through it, found it somewhat interesting. I didn't thumb through it enough to be able to, say I grasped what the text was talking about. I just was thumbing through and saw a couple of interesting things in it, particularly when we're talking about words. I mean, words are so powerful. For instance, we drive on the parkway. We park in the driveway. And a lot of people don't really sit down and really think about and analyze words and their usage. I posted something the other day about racism, and, it talks about how racism is a global system where non-white people are deprived of resources. Then it says, what does a white person consider racism? And a white person considers racism when a black girl makes fun of them or laughs at them. They say that's racist. And so racism has taken on an entirely different definition. Unfortunately, so many victims today are throwing that term around towards one another that it is in so many ways, it's losing its potency as an example to, or as a definition to describe this systematic behavior of these individuals. Because whenever I encounter other victims and I talk about racism, and I always say racism, white supremacy, their eyes kind of glaze over. Like, they'll hear the racism part, but when they hear the white supremacy part, their eyes sort of glaze over. And just this past week, I attended the Sarah Seti and Brother Polite debate, is the white man the devil or are we our worst enemy? And many of those folks in there classify themselves as conscious and had such a poor grasp of word usage that it was really sad to see and experience.
This is 1804. I just wanted to say that recently, for me, the context in which I've heard about 1984 is basically listening to Alex Jones and the Truth Movement type folks, and they're convinced that the proles are them, and that everybody else, the higher ups in that hierarchy, are the Illuminati. So I just wonder how people explain this, that we're convinced the proles are not, and they're convinced the proles are just them, regular white folks in America.
Wow. I certainly am no fan of Alex Jones, but I would say, for that, you can just pay attention to the book. You can read the book and see how they explain the proles, who these people are and how they function, and then you can just look at Alex Jones and see if you think that metaphor is applicable. I think Orwell wrote about that in the essay I was reading, where people frequently will misrepresent things, ideas in metaphors, and making comparisons that are not accurate to hide their meaning. I would say just look and think if you think it's accurate that Alex Jones represents the 85% that are mistreated and they don't have anything, the lowest of the low. If you think Alex Jones is in that group.
Well, he sure as well talks like he is. They feel that, they're losing their freedom. They, all the privacy stuff, the Patriot Act. I mean, he has material for 3 hours a day about how the Illuminati are coming after them, people like him. And they love 1984. They're always talking about it. And when they're talking about 1984, they don't identify with the party and the higher ups in the party. They identify with the people losing their rights. So, I mean, I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying it's just fascinating how the readings are so different, you know, and how they always kind of want to paint themselves as victims.
Well, that is a typical response to expect from Alex Jones and the likes of him. I could only listen to that show for maybe about 5 minutes to get what's going on, and then I have to shut it off because he just have a pitch in his voice. It just grates on my nerves. And then he's one of those stereotype white people. He caters to a certain audience to keep the fear level at a high pitch, and then in order to get whatever it is that he has to push over. They're not seeing themselves as being perpetrators of a crime. They're putting themselves into this victim mode, which is why, Gus, if y'all get a chance, please, I'm begging you, please, go back and listen to that first interview with Dr. Vernelia Randall when she was on Gus's show back in 2009, I believe it was. It will clear a lot of cobwebs. I'm finding myself going back to a lot of those older shows that you did, Gus, and listening to them again for the third, fourth, and fifth time. And it has cleared up a lot of things because what she said in that interview is what we are seeing now with this universality that is going on with black people wanting to not see racism, wanting to say we are all one big family, everyone originated out of Africa. There is really no issue. But there is an issue with us because we are being everyone is more or less, wherever you find black people on any part of this globe, we are in a worse condition than anyone else on this planet. And for you to walk around and saying that we are all in this together, there is no such thing as a color, there is no such thing. I have to keep reminding, as someone who has children, my husband and myself, we have two grown sons. Neither of my sons share my blood type. They came from me. I carried them for 9 months. I'm sure if I was to need an organ replacement, their organs would not be able to be. My body would reject it. So we're all the same ethnicity. They're my children that I carried. So if I can be their mother and have these children, and if their organs are not interchangeable with mine and mine not interchangeable with them, what the heck am I going to say that some white person on this planet is more related to me than my own children? I'm going to say that I see no difference? There is a cellular difference. There's a mental difference. There's a whole lot of difference out here. And we need to cut the foolishness out.
We have about 10 minutes before I want to get to the second audio clip, just to make sure we have time to discuss what's presented in the second audio clip. About another 10 before we get started on that. Anybody have anything specific that they wanted to talk from the book that they heard in the clip this week, or if you something from last week that you didn't get in? Anybody have anything they wanted to touch on from the book?
I wanted to relay something with just the way he was going on about the females. Like it seems like a real theme where there's this strife between the sexes. They just aren't attracted to each other, or they just don't get along, or they're just kind of like they just don't have they just don't, there's no genuine attraction or whatever. But and then it's like the whole ideal of the blonde, he said fair hair, his ex-wife or whatever, his wife. And when I was going to school in California in 2003, real quick, there was this female who everybody was kind of like sprung on, mostly white people, in my class out in the country, and like they were all like, kind of like talking about her and like, who is she? And they were all really interested in her, and she seemed really mild-mannered, and she was very blonde and very blue-eyed and seemed very kind of nice and whatever. She well-kept or whatever. One day, this girl came over to her. I was with a few people. She came over to her house, and she was hanging out with us or whatever, and then like she wanted to drive to their hot springs just out of town, and so we were going to drive to the hot springs, and so we start driving. She's driving, right? And then she's got like a bottle of Jack Daniels that she's like drinking from as she's driving, and like weaving. The canyon is like 100-foot drop down into the it was a Feather River Canyon. Like we're driving down to get to the hot springs, and she's like weaving, like drinking, like while she's driving. I had to like ask her. I'm like, pull over right now. Like I'm gonna take the wheel. I didn't know you were drunk, you know. But it's just like just goes to show just how it's just real, just the way that he described it. It's just like these ideals are meant to be. They're meant to be deceptive, like, you know, the ideal of the white female and then her counterpart, the white male. They're just these like edifices, these fake ideas of people that have things under control, but it's just like a system of deception and the silly, you know, the rhetorical ethic from Urugu, where it's just their nature, it's just the way there's something inside of them that comes out and just is just false. But yeah.
To touch on what the caller just said, also with the, as you said, they have no, from reading from what he expressed, he has no connection towards the opposite sex. It's like they have this hate relationship going with the female, because even his mother, the way how he described his mother from your portion last week, it was as if though he has no attachment. To me, the female sex, he has no attachment towards them. It's like he is an asexual being. And the females are looked at as something to be ridiculed for the sex and violence, as was read in a portion of the book last week, where he felt like having sex in a violent way, doing all sorts of violent things to the female, which just shows the nature of white people. They just have this death. To me, sex and death goes hand in hand. There's no difference for them between one or the other. They have to have some elements of violence have to be displayed in their sexual, in order for them to have some sort of sexual gratification. And you see it in their movies. You read in this book, and this book was written over 60 years ago, and you can see what he has written about white people. It's on display now.
Anything else? Everybody, anything else? I did, there was a passage.
I
go ahead.
just wanted to say that this is 1804. I am also quite puzzled with this real relationship they have with the woman's body. One of the things I'd love to discuss, doesn't have to be tonight, could be in a compensatory call-in, is this the way that they can only conceive of a female body as looking as boyish as possible. And this real, and how white women buy into it and all that stuff. I mean, it's not necessarily related to this, but I'm always puzzled about, I'm always wondering what the root is of this hatred they have of women. But just a thought.
I know in the second portion of the audio, the female love interest, her character, I guess she wasn't really in the audio that we heard so far today, but she is going to pop back up in the second portion of the audio, so there should be more to say about that once the second portion of the audio plays through. But that'll be something interesting to kind of watch how that so-called romantic relationship evolves over the course of the book. But yeah, today maybe we'll have more to say on that today, as her character will come. You'll get more information. I think you'll get her name and all that good stuff later on from the second segment today. That there were, I guess, two quick things I would point out if anybody else, if folks don't have anything else to share. At the beginning of the audio from today, when they were in the cafeteria, Winston and Syme and Parsons, they're sitting down and talking about how great destroying language is. And Parsons, when he starts talking about his children and how they're so keen and they're so great and they're sucking up all this party rhetoric and they're looking for spies. And he says that his daughter was out on I guess they were hiking, and she saw a guy and he had on unusual shoes, and she turned him in, and they think that this guy got killed because he had strange shoes on. And he's describing that's just the atmosphere. That's just the way it is. Everybody is looking for somebody who's a traitor, looking for somebody who's committing face crime, where they make a facial expression that is illegal, or they commit thought crime. They're thinking about something that they're not supposed to be thinking about. Unfortunately, when I heard that, I saw parallels to some of the victims of racism when they become less confused and they begin to look at other non-white people for things that they don't think that non-white person should be doing. Like, oh, you said this, or you're doing this, and that's not what we should be doing to get rid of racism. Unfortunately, I feel like I have seen that sort of behavior really explode where non-white people, when they become less confused, the way that they seem to really get excited about going after other non-white people who are not doing things that they think they should be doing with regards to responding to racism, white supremacy, if that makes sense. The passage about the way, and this is going to be a dominant theme, so I mean there'll be many chances to bring this back up. But that passage, when they're sitting down, again, it's Winston, Syme, and Parsons, when they're sitting down in the cafeteria, when Syme, when he says, don't you see the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought. In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly one word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Already in the 11th edition, we're not far from that point, but the process will still be continuing long after you and I are dead. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Even now, of course, there's no reason or excuse for committing thought crime. It's merely a question of self-discipline, reality control. Never heard that expressed before, reality control. But in the end, there won't be any need for even that. The revolution will be complete when the language is perfect. Newspeak is Ingsoc, and Ingsoc is Newspeak. I've pretty much said why I point out the word fair. You've heard it pop up many times. The language reveals white supremacy so clearly. I would say you could snatch that out and just say English is white supremacy. The words that we're speaking, French, I think, is applicable for all of the languages that white people have put together. Their languages are white supremacy, and you can just look at the words and definitions that they use. The last little chunk of that, the proles are not human beings. He says carelessly, by 2050, earlier probably, all knowledge of old speak will have disappeared. The whole literature of the past will have been destroyed. All these white authors, they'll exist only in Newspeak versions, not merely changed into something different, but actually changed into something contradictory of what they used to be. I even see this. There's a controversy. This was in the New York Times yesterday, where they put a quote on the statue of Martin Luther King Jr. in Washington, D.C., but they edited it. They didn't put it on the statue the way he actually said it. And Maya Angelou and some of Dr. King's family, they were not pleased about this, and they're actually just going to scratch the whole quote out as opposed to correcting it and putting what he actually said. It reminded me of the biography that came out about Malcolm X recently. I think Marble Manning, if I got the name correct, but this whole way of using words to go back and rewrite history so people have a totally different idea about an event or a person, sometimes even writing whole people out of existence. they go on this, how could you have a slogan like freedom is slavery when the concept of freedom has been abolished? That right there, I just thought that was stunning. You're not abolishing slavery. We're abolishing the concept of freedom. Only the white mind could come up with something like that. The book is incredible. It, I think, reveals so much about the system of white supremacy. Anywho, just to make sure that we have time so people can share from the second portion of the audio, I'll go ahead and start that now. Once it's done, everybody will be unmuted and you can get in, share whatever you would like to about the second clip. The second portion, 1984, George Orwell. As soon as it's done, we'll be right back. Context of White Supremacy.
A few agents of the thought police moved always among them, spreading false rumors and marking down and eliminating the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. But no attempt was made to indoctrinate them with the ideology of the party. It was not desirable that the proles should have strong political feelings. All that was required of them was a primitive patriotism, which could be appealed to whenever it was necessary to make them accept longer working hours or shorter rations. And even when they became discontented, as they sometimes did, their discontent led nowhere, because being without general ideas, they could only focus it on petty, specific grievances. The larger evils invariably escaped their notice. The great majority of proles did not even have telescreens in their homes. Even the civil police interfered with them very little. There was a vast amount of criminality in London, a whole world within a world of thieves, bandits, prostitutes, drug peddlers, and racketeers of every description. But since it all happened among the proles themselves, it was of no importance. In all questions of morals, they were allowed to follow their ancestral code. The sexual puritanism of the party was not imposed upon them. Promiscuity went unpunished. Divorce was permitted. For that matter, even religious worship would have been permitted if the proles had shown any sign of needing or wanting it. They were beneath suspicion. As the party slogan put it, proles and animals are free. Winston reached down and cautiously scratched his varicose ulcer. It had begun itching again. The thing you invariably came back to was the impossibility of knowing what life before the revolution had really been like. He took out of the drawer a copy of a children's history textbook which he had borrowed from Mrs. Parsons, and began copying a passage into the diary. In the old days, it ran, before the glorious revolution, London was not the beautiful city that we know today. It was a dark, dirty, miserable place where hardly anybody had enough to eat, and where hundreds and thousands of poor people had no boots on their feet and not even a roof to sleep under. Children no older than you are had to work 12 hours a day for cruel masters who flogged them with whips if they worked too slowly and fed them on nothing but stale bread crusts and water. But in among this terrible poverty there were just a few great, big, beautiful houses that were lived in by rich men who had as many as 30 servants to look after them. These rich men were called capitalists. They were fat, ugly men with wicked faces like the one in the picture on the opposite page. You can see that he is dressed in a long black coat, which was called a frock coat, and a queer, shiny hat shaped like a stovepipe, which was called a top hat. This was the uniform of the capitalists, and no one else was allowed to wear it. The capitalists owned everything in the world, and everyone else was their slave. They owned all the land, all the houses, all the factories, and all the money. If anyone disobeyed them, they could throw him into prison, or they could take his job away and starve him to death. When any ordinary person spoke to a capitalist, he had to cringe and bow to him and take off his cap and address him as Sir. The chief of all the capitalists was called the King, but he knew the rest of the catalogue. There would be mention of the bishops in their lawn sleeves, the judges in their ermine robes, the pillory, the stocks, the treadmill, the cat-o'-nine-tails, the Lord Mayor's banquet, and the practice of kissing the Pope's toe. There was also something called the jus primae noctis, which would probably not be mentioned in a textbook for children. It was the law by which every capitalist had the right to sleep with any woman working in one of his factories. How could you tell how much of it was lies? It might be true that the average human being was better off now than he had been before the revolution. The only evidence to the contrary was the mute protest in your own bones, the instinctive feeling that the conditions you lived in were intolerable and that at some other time they must have been different. It struck him that the truly characteristic thing about modern life was not its cruelty and insecurity, but simply its bareness, its dinginess, its listlessness. Life, if you looked about you, bore no resemblance not only to the lies that streamed out of the telescreens, but even to the ideals that the party was trying to achieve. Great areas of it, even for a party member, were neutral and non-political, a matter of slogging through dreary jobs, fighting for a place on the tube, darning a worn-out sock, cadging a saccharin tablet, saving a cigarette end. The ideal set up by the party was something huge, terrible, and glittering. A world of steel and concrete, of monstrous machines and terrifying weapons. A nation of warriors and fanatics marching forward in perfect unity, all thinking the same thoughts and shouting the same slogans, perpetually working, fighting, triumphing, persecuting, 300 million people, all with the same face. The reality was decaying, dingy cities where underfed people shuffled to and fro in leaky shoes, in patched-up 19th-century houses that smelt always of cabbage and bad lavatories. He seemed to see a vision of London, vast and ruinous, city of 1,000,000 dustbins, and mixed up with it was a picture of Mrs. Parsons, a woman with lined face and wispy hair, fiddling helplessly with a blocked waste-pipe. He reached down and scratched his ankle again. Day and night the telescreens bruised your ears with statistics proving that people today had more food, more clothes, better houses, better recreations, that they lived longer, worked shorter hours, were bigger, healthier, stronger, happier, more intelligent, better educated than the people of 50 years ago. Not a word of it could ever be proved or disproved. The party claimed, for example, that today 40% of adult proles were literate. Before the revolution, it was said, the number had only been 15%. The party claimed that the infant mortality rate was now only 160 per 1,000, whereas before the revolution it had been 300, and so it went on. It was like a single equation with two unknowns. It might very well be that literally every word in the history books, even the things that one accepted without question, was pure fantasy. For all he knew, there might never have been any such law as the jus primae noctis, or any such creature as a capitalist, or any such garment as a top hat. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became truth. Just once in his life he had possessed, after the event, that was what counted, concrete, unmistakable evidence of an act of falsification. He had held it between his fingers for as long as 30 seconds. In 1973, it must have been. At any rate, it was at about the time when he and Catherine had parted. But the really relevant date was 7 or 8 years earlier. The story really began in the middle 60s, the period of the great purges in which the original leaders of the revolution were wiped out once and for all. By 1970, none of them was left except Big Brother himself. All the rest had by that time been exposed as traitors and counter-revolutionaries. Goldstein had fled and was hiding, no one knew where, and of the others a few had simply disappeared, while the majority had been executed after spectacular public trials at which they had made confession of their crimes. Among the last survivors were 3 men named Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. It must have been in 1965 that these 3 had been arrested. As often happened, they had vanished for a year or more, so that one did not know whether they were alive or dead, and then had suddenly been brought forth to incriminate themselves in the usual way. They had confessed to intelligence with the enemy at that date, too. The enemy was Eurasia, embezzlement of public funds, the murder of various trusted party members, intrigues against the leadership of Big Brother, which had started long before the revolution happened, and acts of sabotage causing the death of hundreds of thousands of people. After confessing to these things, they had been pardoned, reinstated in the party, and given posts, which were in fact sinecures, but which sounded important. All 3 had written long, abject articles in the Times, analyzing the reasons for their defection and promising to make amends. Some time after their release, Winston had actually seen all 3 of them in the Chestnut Tree Cafe. He remembered the sort of terrified fascination with which he had watched them out of the corner of his eye. They were men far older than himself, relics of the ancient world, almost the last great figures left over from the heroic early days of the party. The glamour of the underground struggle and the Civil War still faintly clung to them. He had the feeling, though already at that time facts and dates were growing blurry, that he had known their names earlier than he had known that of Big Brother. But also they were outlaws, enemies, untouchables, doomed with absolute certainty to extinction within a year or 2. No one who had once fallen into the hands of the thought police ever escaped in the end. They were corpses, waiting to be sent back to the grave. There was no one at any of the tables nearest to them. It was not wise even to be seen in the neighbourhood of such people. They were sitting in silence before glasses of the gin flavoured with cloves, which was the specialty of the café. Of the three, it was Rutherford whose appearance had most impressed Winston. Rutherford had once been a famous caricaturist, whose brutal cartoons had helped to inflame popular opinion before and during the Revolution. Even now, at long intervals, his cartoons were appearing in the Times. They were simply an imitation of his earlier manner, and curiously lifeless and unconvincing. Always they were a rehashing of the ancient themes: slum tenements, starving children, street battles, capitalists and top hats. Even on the barricades the capitalists still seemed to cling to their top hats, an endless, hopeless effort to get back into the past. He was a monstrous man, with a mane of greasy grey hair, his face pouched and seamed with protuberant lips. At one time he must have been immensely strong. Now his great body was sagging, sloping, bulging, falling away in every direction. He seemed to be breaking up before one's eyes, like a mountain crumbling. It was the lonely hour of 15. Winston could not now remember how he had come to be in the cafe at such a time. The place was almost empty. A tinny music was trickling from the telescreens. The three men sat in their corner almost motionless, never speaking. Uncommanded, the waiter brought fresh glasses of gin. There was a chessboard on the table beside them, with the pieces set out, but no game started. And then, for perhaps half a minute in all, something happened to the telescreens. The tune that they were playing changed, and the tone of the music changed too. There came into it, but it was something hard to describe. It was a peculiar, cracked, braying, jeering note. In his mind, Winston called it a yellow note. And then a voice from the telescreen was singing, "Under the spreading chestnut tree I sold you and you sold me. There lie they and here lie we, under the spreading chestnut tree." The three men never stirred. But when Winston glanced again at Rutherford's ruinous face, he saw that his eyes were full of tears. And for the first time he noticed with a kind of inward shudder, and yet not knowing at what he shuddered, that both Aronson and Rutherford had broken noses. A little later all three were rearrested. It appeared that they had engaged in fresh conspiracies from the very moment of their release. At their second trial they confessed to all their old crimes over again, with a whole string of new ones. They were executed, and their fate was recorded in the party histories, a warning to posterity. About 5 years after this, in 1973, Winston was unrolling a wad of documents which had just flopped out of the pneumatic tube onto his desk, when he came on a fragment of paper which had evidently been slipped in among the others and then forgotten. The instant he had flattened it out, he saw its significance. It was a half-page torn out of the Times of about 10 years earlier, the top half of the page, so that it included the date, and it contained a photograph of the delegates at some party function in New York. Prominent in the middle of the group were Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. There was no mistaking them. In any case, their names were in the caption at the bottom. The point was that at both trials, all three men had confessed that on that date they had been on Eurasian soil. They had flown from a secret airfield in Canada to a rendezvous somewhere in Siberia, and had conferred with members of the Eurasian General Staff, to whom they had betrayed important military secrets. The date had stuck in Winston's memory because it chanced to be Midsummer Day. But the whole story must be on record in countless other places as well. There was only one possible conclusion. The confessions were lies. Of course, this was not in itself a discovery. Even at that time, Winston had not imagined that the people who were wiped out in the purges had actually committed the crimes that they were accused of. But this was concrete evidence. It was a fragment of the abolished past, like a fossil bone which turns up in the wrong stratum and destroys a geological theory. It was enough to blow the party to atoms if in some way it could have been published to the world and its significance made known. He had gone straight on working. As soon as he saw what the photograph was and what it meant, he had covered it up with another sheet of paper. Luckily, when he unrolled it, it had been upside down from the point of view of the telescreen. He took his scribbling pad on his knee and pushed back his chair so as to get as far away from the telescreen as possible. To keep your face expressionless was not difficult, and even your breathing could be controlled with an effort. But you could not control the beating of your heart, and the telescreen was quite delicate enough to pick it up. He let what he judged to be 10 minutes go by, tormented all the while by the fear that some accident, a sudden draft blowing across his desk, for instance, would betray him. Then, without uncovering it again, he dropped the photograph into the memory hole, along with some other waste papers. Within another minute, perhaps, it would have crumbled into ashes. That was 11 years ago. Today, probably, he would have kept that photograph. It was curious that the fact of having held it in his fingers seemed to him to make a difference, even now, when the photograph itself, as well as the event it recorded, was only memory. Was the party's hold upon the past less strong, he wondered, because a piece of evidence which existed no longer had once existed? But today, supposing that it could be somehow resurrected from its ashes, the photograph might not even be evidence. Already at the time when he made his discovery, Oceania was no longer at war with Eurasia, and it must have been to the agents of Eurasia that the 3 dead men had betrayed their country. Since then there had been other changes. 2, 3, he could not remember how many. Very likely the confessions had been rewritten and rewritten until the original facts and dates no longer had the smallest significance. The past not only changed, but changed continuously. What most afflicted him with the sense of nightmare was that he had never clearly understood why the huge imposture was undertaken. The immediate advantages of falsifying the past were obvious, but the ultimate motive was mysterious. He took up his pen again and wrote, "I understand how. I do not understand why." He wondered, as he had many times wondered before, whether he himself was a lunatic. Perhaps a lunatic was simply a minority of one. At one time it had been a sign of madness to believe that the earth goes round the sun. Today, to believe that the past is unalterable. He might be alone in holding that belief, and if alone, then a lunatic. But the thought of being a lunatic did not greatly trouble him. The horror was that he might also be wrong. He picked up the children's history book and looked at the portrait of Big Brother which formed its frontispiece. The hypnotic eyes gazed into his own. It was as though some huge force were pressing down upon you, something that penetrated inside your skull, battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense. And what was terrifying was not that they would kill you for thinking otherwise, but that they might be right. For after all, how do we know that 2 and 2 make 4? Or that the force of gravity works, or that the past is unchangeable? If both the past and the external world exist only in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? But no. His courage seemed suddenly to stiffen of its own accord. The face of O'Brien, not called up by any obvious association, had floated into his mind. He knew with more certainty than before that O'Brien was on his side. He was writing the diary for O'Brien, to O'Brien. It was like an interminable letter which no one would ever read, but which was addressed to a particular person and took its color from that fact. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. His heart sank as he thought of the enormous power arrayed against him, the ease with which any party intellectual would overthrow him in debate, the subtle arguments which he would not be able to understand, much less answer. And yet he was in the right. They were wrong and he was right. The obvious, the silly, and the true had got to be defended. Truisms are true. Hold on to that. The solid world exists. Its laws do not change. Stones are hard, water is wet, objects unsupported fall toward the earth's center. With the feeling that he was speaking to O'Brien and also that he was setting forth an important axiom, he wrote, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." Chapter 8. From somewhere at the bottom of a passage, the smell of roasting coffee, real coffee, not Victory coffee, came floating out into the street. Winston paused involuntarily. For perhaps 2 seconds he was back in the half-forgotten world of his childhood. Then a door banged, seeming to cut off the smell as abruptly as though it had been a sound. He had walked several kilometers over pavements, and his varicose also was throbbing. This was the second time in 3 weeks that he had missed an evening at the community center, a rash act, since you could be certain that the number of your attendances at the center were carefully checked. In principle, a party member had no spare time, and was never alone except in bed. It was assumed that when he was not working, eating, or sleeping, he would be taking part in some kind of communal recreations. To do anything that suggested a taste for solitude, even to go for a walk by yourself, was always slightly dangerous. There was a word for it in Newspeak. Own life, it was called, meaning individualism and eccentricity. But this evening, as he came out of the ministry, the balminess of the April air had tempted him. The sky was a warmer blue than he had seen in that year. And suddenly the long, noisy evening at the centre, the boring, exhausting games, the lectures, the creaking camaraderie oiled by gin had seemed intolerable. On impulse he had turned away from the bus stop and wandered off into the labyrinth of London, first south, then east, then north again, losing himself along unknown streets and hardly bothering in which direction he was going. "If there is hope," he had written in the diary, "it lies in the proles." The words kept coming back to him, statement of a mystical truth and a palpable absurdity. He was somewhere in the vague, brown-coloured slums to the north and east of what had once been St. Pancras Station. He was walking up a cobbled street of little 2-story houses with battered doorways which gave straight onto the pavement and which were somehow curiously suggestive of rat holes. There were puddles of filthy water here and there among the cobbles. In and out of the dark doorways and down narrow alleyways that branched off on either side, people swarmed in astonishing numbers, girls in full bloom with crudely lipsticked mouths, and youths who chased the girls, and swollen, waddling women who showed you what the girls would be like in 10 years' time, and old, bent creatures shuffling along on splayed feet, and ragged, barefooted children who played in puddles and then scattered at angry yells from their mothers. Perhaps a quarter of the windows in the street were broken and boarded up. Most of the people paid no attention to Winston. A few eyed him with a sort of guarded curiosity. 2 monstrous women with brick-red forearms folded across their aprons were talking outside a doorway. Winston caught scraps of conversation as he approached. "Yes," I says to her, "that's all very well," I says, "but if you'd been in my place you'd have done the same as what I done. It's easy to criticize," I says, "but you ain't got the same problems as what I got." "Ah," says the other, "that's just it. That's just where it is." The strident voices stopped abruptly. The women studied him in hostile silence as he went past. But it was not hostility, exactly. Merely a kind of wariness, a momentary stiffening, as at the passing of some unfamiliar animal. The blue overalls of the party could not be a common sight in a street like this. Indeed, it was unwise to be seen in such places, unless you had definite business there. The patrols might stop you if you happened to run into them. "May I see your papers, comrade? What are you doing here? What time did you leave work? Is this your usual way home?" and so on and so forth. Not that there was any rule against walking home by an unusual route, but it was enough to draw attention to you if the thought police heard about it. Suddenly the whole street was in commotion. There were yells of warning from all sides. People were shooting into the doorways like rabbits. A young woman leapt out of a doorway a little ahead of Winston, grabbed up a tiny child playing in a puddle, whipped her apron about it, and leapt back again, all in one movement. At the same instant, a man in a concertina-like black suit who had emerged from a side alley ran toward Winston, pointing excitedly to the sky. "Steamer!" he yelled. "Look out, governor! Bang overhead! Lay down, quick!" Steamer was a nickname which for some reason the proles applied to rocket bombs. Winston promptly flung himself on his face. The proles were nearly always right when they gave you a warning of this kind. They seemed to possess some kind of instinct which told them several seconds in advance when a rocket was coming, although the rocket supposedly travelled faster than sound. Winston clasped his forearms about his head. There was a roar that seemed to make the pavement heave. A shower of light objects pattered onto his back. When he stood up, he found that he was covered with fragments of glass from the nearest window. He walked on. The bomb had demolished a group of houses 200 meters up the street. A black plume of smoke hung in the sky, and below it a cloud of plaster dust, in which a crowd was already forming round the ruins. There was a little pile of plaster lying on the pavement ahead of him, and in the middle of it he could see a bright red streak. When he got up to it, he saw that it was a human hand, severed at the wrist. Apart from the bloody stump, the hand was so completely whitened as to resemble a plaster cast. He kicked the thing into the gutter, and then, to avoid the crowd, turned down a side street to the right. Within 3 or 4 minutes he was out of the area which the bomb had affected, and the sordid, swarming life of the streets was going on as though nothing had happened. It was nearly 20 hours, and the drinking shops which the proles frequented, pubs they called them, were choked with customers. From their grimy swing doors, endlessly opening and shutting, there came forth a smell of urine, sawdust, and sour beer. In an angle formed by a projecting house front, 3 men were standing very close together, the middle one of them holding a folded-up newspaper which the other 2 were studying over his shoulders. Even before he was near enough to make out the expression on their faces, Winston could see absorption in every line of their bodies. It was obviously some serious piece of news that they were reading. He was a few paces away from them when suddenly the group broke up, and 2 of the men were in a violent altercation. For a moment they seemed almost on the point of blows. "Can't you bleeding well listen to what I say? I tell you no number ending in 7 ain't won for over 14 months. "Yes, it has, then." "No, it has not. Back home I got the whole lot of 'em for over 2 years wrote down on a piece of paper. I takes 'em down, regular as the clock, and I tell you no number ending in 7. Yes, a 7 has one. I could pretty near tell you the bleeding number, 407 it ended in. It were in February, 2nd week in February. February, your grandmother. I got it all down in black and white, and I tell you no number—" "Ow, pack it in," said the 3rd man. They were talking about the lottery. Winston looked back when he had gone 30 meters. They were still arguing with vivid, passionate faces. The lottery, with its weekly payout of enormous prizes, was the one public event to which the proles paid serious attention. It was probable that there were some millions of proles for whom the lottery was the principal, if not the only reason for remaining alive. It was their delight, their folly, their anodyne, their intellectual stimulant. Where the lottery was concerned, even people who could barely read and write seemed capable of intricate calculations and staggering feats of memory. There was a whole tribe of men who made a living simply by selling systems, forecasts, and lucky amulets. Winston had nothing to do with the running of the lottery, which was managed by the Ministry of Plenty, but he was aware, indeed everyone in the party was aware, that the prizes were largely imaginary. Only small sums were actually paid out, the winners of the big prizes being non-existent persons. In the absence of any real intercommunication between one part of Oceania and another, this was not difficult to arrange. But if there was hope, it lay in the proles. You had to cling on to that. When you put it in words, it sounded reasonable. It was when you looked at the human beings passing you on the pavement that it became an act of faith. The street into which he had turned ran downhill. He had a feeling that he had been in this neighborhood before, and that there was a main thoroughfare not far away. From somewhere ahead came a din of shouting voices. The street took a sharp turn and then ended in a flight of steps, which led down into a sunken alley where a few stall-keepers were selling tired-looking vegetables. At this moment Winston remembered where he was. The alley led out into the main street, and down the next turning, not 5 minutes away, was the junk shop where he had bought the blank book which was now his diary. And in a small stationer's shop not far away he had bought his penholder and his bottle of ink. He paused for a moment at the top of the steps. On the opposite side of the alley there was a dingy little pub, whose windows appeared to be frosted over, but in reality were merely coated with dust. A very old man, bent but active, with white moustaches that bristled forward like those of a prawn, pushed open the swing door and went in. As Winston stood watching, it occurred to him that the old man, who must be 80 at the least, had already been middle-aged when the revolution happened. He and a few others like him were the last links that now existed with the vanished world of capitalism. In the party itself, there were not many people left whose ideas had been formed before the revolution. The older generation had mostly been wiped out in the great purges of the 50s and 60s, and the few who survived had long ago been terrified into complete intellectual surrender. If there was anyone alive who could give you a truthful account of conditions in the early part of the century, it could only be a prole. Suddenly the passage from the history book that he had copied into his diary came back into Winston's mind, and a lunatic impulse took hold of him. He would go into the pub. He would scrape acquaintance with that old man and question him. He would say to him, "Tell me about your life when you were a boy. What was it like in those days? Were things better than they are now, or were they worse?" Hurriedly, lest he should have time to become frightened, he descended the steps and crossed the narrow street. It was madness, of course. As usual, there was no definite rule against talking to proles and frequenting their pubs, but it was far too unusual an action to pass unnoticed. If the patrols appeared, he might plead an attack of faintness, but it was not likely that they would believe him. He pushed open the door, and a hideous, cheesy smell of sour beer hit him in the face. As he entered, the din of voices dropped to about half its volume. Behind his back, he could feel everyone eyeing his blue overalls. A game of darts, which was going on at the other end of the room, interrupted itself for perhaps as much as 30 seconds. The old man whom he had followed was standing at the bar, having some kind of altercation with the barman, a large, stout, hook-nosed young man with enormous forearms. A knot of others standing round with glasses in their hands were watching the scene. "I asked you civil enough, didn't I?" said the old man, straightening his shoulders pugnaciously. "You telling me you ain't got a pint mug in the old bleeding boozer?" "And what in hell's name is a pint?" said the barman, leaning forward with the tips of his fingers on the counter. "Look at him! Calls himself a barman and don't know what a pint is. Why, a pint's the half of a quart, and there's 4 quarts to the gallon. Have to teach you the ABC next?" "Never heard of him," said the barman shortly. "Litre and half-litre, that's all we serve. There's the glasses on the shelf in front of you." "I'd like a pint," persisted the old man. "You could have drawed me off a pint easy enough. We didn't have these bleeding litres when I was a young man." "When you were a young man, we were all living in the treetops," said the barman with a glance at the other customers. There was a shout of laughter, and the uneasiness caused by Winston's entry seemed to disappear. The old man's white, stubbled face had flushed pink. He was turned away, muttering to himself, and bumped into Winston. Winston caught him gently by the arm. "May I offer you a drink?" he said. "You're a gent," said the other, straightening his shoulders again. He appeared not to have noticed Winston's blue overalls. "Pint," he added aggressively to the barman. "Pint or wallop." The barman swished 2 half-litres of dark brown beer into thick glasses which he had rinsed in a bucket under the counter. Beer was the only drink you could get in prole pubs. The proles were not supposed to drink gin, though in practice they could get hold of it easily enough. The game of darts was in full swing again, and the knot of men at the bar had begun talking about lottery tickets. Winston's presence was forgotten for a moment. There was a deal table under the window where he and the old man could talk without fear of being overheard. It was horribly dangerous. But at any rate there was no telescreen in the room, a point he had made sure of as soon as he came in. "He could have drawed me off a pint," grumbled the old man as he settled down behind his glass. "A half-litre ain't enough. It don't satisfy, and a whole litre's too much. It starts my bladder running, let alone the price." "You must have seen great changes since you were a young man," said Winston tentatively. The old man's pale blue eyes moved from the darts board to the bar, and from the bar to the door of the gents, as though it were in the bar-room that he expected the changes to have occurred. "The beer was better," he said finally, "and cheaper. When I was a young man, mild beer, wallop, we used to call it, was 4pence a pint. That was before the war, of course." "Which war was that?" said Winston. "It's all wars," said the old man vaguely. He took up his glass and his shoulders straightened again. "Here's wishing you the very best of health." In his lean throat, the sharp-pointed Adam's apple made a surprisingly rapid up-and-down movement, and the beer vanished. Winston went to the bar and came back with 2 more half-litres. The old man appeared to have forgotten his prejudice against drinking a full litre. "You are very much older than I am," said Winston. "You must have been a grown man before I was born. You can remember what it was like in the old days, before the Revolution. People of my age don't really know anything about those times. We can only read about them in books, and what it says in the books may not be true. I should like your opinion on that. The history books say that life before the revolution was completely different from what it is now. There was the most terrible oppression, injustice, poverty, worse than anything we can imagine. Here in London, the great mass of the people never had enough to eat from birth to death. Half of them hadn't even boots on their feet. They worked 12 hours a day. They left school at 9. They slept 10 in a room. And at the same time, there were only a very few people, only a few thousands, the capitalists they were called, who were rich and powerful. They owned everything that there was to own. They lived in great, gorgeous houses with 30 servants. They rode about in motor cars and 4-horse carriages. They drank champagne. They wore top hats. The old man brightened suddenly. "Top hats," he said. "Funny you should mention 'em. The same thing come into my head only yesterday. I don't know why, I was just thinking I ain't seen a top hat in years. Gone right out, they have. The last time I worn one was at my sister-in-law's funeral. And that was, well, I couldn't give you the date, but it must have been 50 years ago. Of course, it was only hired for the occasion, you understand." It isn't very important about the top hats," said Winston patiently. "The point is, these capitalists, they and a few lawyers and priests and so forth who lived on them, were the lords of the earth. Everything existed for their benefit. You, the ordinary people, the workers, were their slaves. They could do what they liked with you. They could ship you off to Canada like cattle. They could sleep with your daughters if they chose. They could order you to be flogged with something called a cat-o'-nine-tails. You had to take your cap off when you passed them. Every capitalist went about with a gang of lackeys who—" The old man brightened again. "Lackeys," he said. "Now there's a word I ain't heard ever since so long. Lackeys. That regular takes me back, that does. I recollect, donkeys years ago, I used to sometimes go to Hyde Park of a Sunday afternoon to hear the blokes making speeches. Salvation Army, Roman Catholics, Jews, Indians, all sorts there was. And there was one bloke— well, I couldn't give you his name, but a real powerful speaker he was. He didn't half give it to him. Lackeys, he says, lackeys of the bourgeoisie, flunkies of the ruling class, parasites, that was another of them, and hyenas. He definitely called them hyenas. Of course, he was referring to the Labour Party, you understand." Winston had the feeling that they were talking at cross purposes. "What I really wanted to know was this," he said. "Do you feel that you have more freedom now than you had in those days? Are you treated more like a human being? In the old days, the rich people, the people at the top—" "The House of Lords," put in the old man reminiscently. "The House of Lords, if you like. What I'm asking is, were these people able to treat you as an inferior simply because they were rich and you were poor? Is it a fact, for instance, that you had to call them sir and take off your cap when you passed them?" The old man appeared to think deeply. He drank off about a quarter of his beer before answering. "Yes," he said. "They liked you to touch your cap to 'em. It showed respect like. I didn't agree with it myself, but I done it often enough. Had to, as you might say." "And was it usual— I'm only quoting what I've read in history books— was it usual for these people and their servants to push you off the pavement into the gutter?" "One of 'em pushed me once," said the old man. "I recollect it as if it were yesterday. It was boat race night. Terrible rowdy they used to get on boat race night, and I bumps into a young bloke on Shaftesbury Avenue. Quite the gent he was, dress shirt, top hat, black overcoat. He was kind of zigzagging across the pavement, and I bumps into him accidental-like. He says, 'Why can't you look where you're going?' he says. I says, 'Do you think you bocked the bleeding pavement?' He says, 'I'd twist your bloody head off if you get fresh with me.' I says, 'You're drunk. I'll give you in charge in half a minute,' I says. And if you'll believe me, he puts his hand on my chest and gives me a shove as pretty near sent me under the wheels of a bus. Well, I was young in them days, and I was going to have fetched him one, only—" A sense of helplessness took hold of Winston. The old man's memory was nothing but a rubbish heap of details. One could question him all day without getting any real information. The party histories might still be true after a fashion. They might even be completely true. He made a last attempt. "Perhaps I have not made myself clear," he said. "What I'm trying to say is this. You have been alive a very long time. You lived half your life before the Revolution. In 1925, for instance, you were already grown up. Would you say, from what you can remember, that life in 1925 was better than it is now, or worse? If you could choose, would you prefer to live then or now?" The old man looked meditatively at the darts board. He finished up his beer more slowly than before. When he spoke, it was with a tolerant, philosophic air, as though the beer had mellowed him. "I know what you'd expect me to say," he said. "You expect me to say as I'd sooner be young again. Most people would say they'd sooner be young if you asked them. You got your health and strength when you're young. When you get to my time of life, you ain't never well. I suffer something wicked from my feet, and my bladder's just terrible. 6 and 7 times a night it has me out of bed. On the other hand, there's great advantages in being an old man. You ain't got the same worries. No truck with women, and that's a great thing. I ain't had a woman for near on 30 year, if you'd credit me, nor wanted to, what's more." Winston sat back against the windowsill. There was no use going on. He was about to buy some more beer when the old man suddenly got up and shuffled rapidly into the stinking urinal at the side of the room. The extra half-liter was already working on him. Winston sat for a minute or two gazing at his empty glass, and hardly noticed when his feet carried him out into the street again. Within 20 years at the most, he reflected, the huge and simple question, was life better before the revolution than it is now, would have ceased once and for all to be answerable. But in effect it was unanswerable even now, since the few scattered survivors from the ancient world were incapable of comparing one age with another. They remembered a million useless things, a quarrel with a workmate, a hunt for a lost bicycle pump, the expression on a long-dead sister's face, the swirls of dust on a windy morning 70 years ago. But all the relevant facts were outside the range of their vision. They were like the ant, which can see small objects but not large ones. And when memory failed and written records were falsified, when that happened, the claim of the party to have improved the conditions of human life had got to be accepted, because there did not exist, and never again could exist, any standard against which it could be tested. At this moment his train of thought stopped abruptly. He halted and looked up. It was in a narrow street with a few dark little shops interspersed among dwelling houses. Immediately above his head there hung 3 discoloured metal balls, which looked as if they had once been gilded. He seemed to know the place. Of course! He was standing outside the junk shop where he had bought the diary. A twinge of fear went through him. It had been a sufficiently rash act to buy the book in the beginning, and he had sworn never to come near the place again. And yet the instant that he allowed his thoughts to wander, his feet had brought him back here of their own accord. It was precisely against suicidal impulses of this kind that he had hoped to guard himself by opening the diary. At the same time, he noticed that although it was nearly 21 hours, the shop was still open. With the feeling that he would be less conspicuous inside than hanging about on the pavement, he stepped through the doorway. If questioned, he could plausibly say that he was trying to buy razor blades.
This ends side 2 of cassette 2. Please stop the tape before fast-forwarding to the end and loading cassette 3.
Context of White Supremacy. If you would like to participate, the number to dial, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. We have about 30 minutes left in the program, about 30 minutes. Do not wait until the last minute. Get your hand up if you have something you want to share. Number one more time, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Briefly, Dr. Manning Marble, name I think I was getting at before, who wrote the biography on Malcolm X, which was published after Dr. Marble's death. No coincidence there, but the point I was making earlier. And also, George Orwell, the book that I was referencing, Burmese Days, another great book I would say to check out to study white supremacy. A white person told me to read this book when I was doing a lot of studying on the incorrectness of sex between white people and non-white people. And they said, oh, yeah, you should read George Orwell's Burmese Days. If you're a George Orwell fan, check out Burmese Days. It was published in 1934. If anyone wants to do any additional reading. Be more. Your line should be open. You didn't participate during the first portion, so make sure we get to hear from you. If you want to share first, feel free.
Peace, Gus, and all the other listeners. Just this whole talk of how they're making history seem so horrible, like things are so much better now. Two things came to mind: the whole idea of a post-racial society, and also formal slavery and segregation. Basically, during formal slavery and segregation, they made it like things were so bad that then, they stick the dogs on us and they water hosed us and all this stuff. But in a sense, I've studied African American history. That was actually my minor. And it was like, even though those things were going on, we were better off then because, our education was better. I feel like we were more unified and things like that. And it's like nowadays, things are supposed to be better as far as technology and medicine advancing, but it's like more diseases are more rampant and people are dying more from cancer and things like that. So when they were talking about how basically history was horrible before the revolution, I see that the same way now. Like they try to make it like history was so bad, and now because they're not spraying us with water hose and things like that, that things are so much better when there's still so much going on under the system of racism and white supremacy. And another point that stuck out was when they were talking about the men being executed, and it went down in history as a warning. I thought about formal slavery again, how they used to castrate, burn, beat, and hang on whites in front of other slaves as a warning as well, to instill fear in them. Another thing that stuck out was this whole rejecting evidence of your eyes and ears. It's basically how you can't trust your senses. Like they put these things in the media, whether on television or in the paper, to sort of get your mind off of what's really going on. So that stuck out. And then the whole talk of the lottery, that's another thing that they use to get your mind off what's really going on. They'll talk about the Powerball or different things to sort of get your mind on that and, again, get your mind off what's really going on. And then one thing that I thought that was still intact is this whole you can get wisdom from elders, but then it's like once he went to the pub to talk to the old man and wanted to question him, it's like the old man really couldn't even tell him anything. And I feel like that's something that's going on again today. Like we're supposed to get the wisdom from elders, but it's like even though they're old in age, they're lacking sort of that maturity and that wisdom. So yeah, we can't even really receive wisdom from some elders like it used to be. But those are the only things I really have.
I wanted to chime in about an omission. Now, I don't know what different versions people have, but there was one glaring omission or change when he was talking about the capitalists. Now, this is what I have in my version. I have a Kindle version that has all of George Orwell's works, but he's talking about the capitalists, and he said he was a monstrous man with a mane of greasy gray hair, his face pouched and seamed with thick negroid lips. And I believe the audiobook said protruding lips. So I was wondering why that was changed and what versions was it changed from negroid to protruding. I don't know if you found that part, Gus, in your book.
I'm looking at the book. I'm scrolling back for that. Great catch, though. Great catch. Okay.
You caught an evidence of falsification. It's now on record.
Yeah, I guess the beginning of the paragraph is there was no one at any of the tables nearest to them. It was not even wise to be seen in the neighborhood of such people. And it's sort of down past that when he's describing the capitalist.
Oh, okay. I'm scrolling.
I also want to mention that the way that he's describing capitalists seemed like you could replace capitalists with white supremacists, and it would fit perfectly. Other things I noted were the statistics used to deceive people, and it just made me think of the bell curve. And I remember just a personal story. One time I was in college, and I was struggling in a chemistry class, so I went to see a counselor to give me advice about how to improve. And the first thing she asked me was, "Are your parents?" And I said yes. And she told me, statistically speaking, people from divorced households do not do as well in school as people who have intact homes. So I just thought that was a perfect example of someone using statistics to sort of mistreat people or mislead or deceive people. And that's all I want to say.
It says Negroid. In my version, the written version, has Negroid too.
Yeah. Did people hear that? That he said protruding on the audiobook rather than Negroid?
Yeah.
So even the audiobook is using Newspeak.
What I caught was I found it kind of, it's like you can't really say that with who the poles are, it's kind of obvious. He was talking to the bartender. The bartender was talking with the patron, and he was talking about back in the day or whatever, and he was like, "Oh, back in the day, we were up in the trees." I was like, "Whoa!" Like, who else is that supposed to be directed towards? And then the lottery thing. I mean, I have a different frame of reference for the lottery thing, but I think didn't that come from numbers, which black people started? I could be wrong about that. What does anybody else think about that?
It definitely reminded me of black people.
With the numbers.
Yes, that's true with the numbers running that was started by black people, and that is what came into being with the U.S., the lottery system, because black people were making too much money in the Harlem area, and they decided to take that concept and turn it into a lottery system in order to have more control of it.
Yeah, my grandmother's from the Ivory Coast. My great grandmother's from the Ivory Coast, and apparently, my mother was talking about stuff because my grandma just recently passed away, and she was telling me about how my great grandma from the Ivory Coast was involved in, and it wasn't like how it is now. They changed the whole thing into this very capitalist kind of paradigm, but it was more of a family. I don't know. It's a community thing, I guess.
Something that stood out to me is the quote, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4." And that particularly was a profound quote that stood out to me. And the other one was, "Heresy of heresy is common sense." So and then also they talked about individualism. They called it own life, and it was dangerous. And they made it like solitude was a criminal act. So if you looked at that or you drew the parallel to individuals who attempt to become less confused, and as Mr. Fuller suggests, that you minimize conflict with other victims. So if many people who are attempting to gain a broader understanding of this system do so by being in solitude and minimizing their conflict with other victims, that would be considered a criminal act in regards to the context of this particular book.
What also got to me was the use of the statistics, which we are seeing now in today's era, how they can manipulate data and use it to gain or to push forward a certain agenda by playing with the information, as he mentioned with what he does, how he can they just make things up and they just put it out here, which is one reason why when people listen to the news and they always go with the stats and say, oh, well, there are more black women that are HIV positive and have venereal diseases, and more black children are coming from unwed homes. And I'm just asking myself, so, well, where did you get this information? Have you went around the country and interviewed all the black people to know exactly what is going on in these homes? This is why people know this data. People who want to demonize you, and these are the same people's information that we are running with and accepting it as facts. And it is not correct information. So it just goes to show how way back then, how he was talking about how the manipulation of the data to get people to think a certain way and to perform a certain way. And we are seeing it like right now, as we saw from that past election show that they put on for us, and the manipulation of the data and how they had things going to now, how they play with numbers.
I would agree with that. Particularly, it brings to mind something that I heard author Jenks Morton bring up, where he talked about the statistic where they say that there are more black males in jail or incarcerated than in college. And on the surface, people hear that and they just believe it. But when he did the actual numbers, what you're comparing is you're comparing a demographic of black males between the ages of 18 and 24 years old, which is about 6 years, and you're comparing that to a demographic of black males between the ages of like 16 to 65 plus years old. So you can't compare people from a group of 16 to 65 years old to a demographic of 6 years and think that just numerically makes sense. But, on the surface, when it's repeated repetitiously enough, we get this sort of dismal perspective on black males, and we get this sort of perspective that black males are, unable or incapable of, excelling academically, and that, we have a higher level of criminality than any other so-called group in the society. And most folks just repeat that statistic over and over again. They never question the source of the statistic. They never go back and look at the actual math. And it is true. People repeatedly talk about the percentage of black women or black females who are not married, and they quote all these statistics, but I've never had anyone come up to me and ask me to participate in any of these so-called groups where they're compiling these statistics. In fact, I don't know anyone who's participated in any of these groups where they compiled any of these statistics, but yet and still people readily cite them repeatedly.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is what the dominant group, they want us to think. They want to put you in this negative frame of mind to think of yourself as being so-called disadvantaged, that there's something wrong with us, why it is that we have the most disease, this focusing on the continent of Africa with the HIV and the AIDS to make it the face of this disease that they made up. And it's just the demonization of black people all around the planet. And a lot of us, we go with these things and we think the worst of ourselves. And it's, as he said, they're playing with the numbers.
It's like somebody said earlier something about not being able to trust your senses, and I think like I can totally relate to that. And just growing up with really no additional information and in a place that is like very refined in one world, there was like no documentation that I could even that I knew of or was like familiar with that would even argue anything like for instance that, you know, Africans do actually have a history, you know, or whatever. And it's talking about erasing, I don't know. Anyways, yeah, and people will like will attack you with all this information that has been like built on one side, it seems like, and then there's like a small pocket of, you know, so-called conscious people or whatever who know more information. I'm sorry, I'm not as used to getting my points across, so it kind of sounds weird.
Yeah, I think that passage is one of the hallmark moments from the book. If you see the film, I think they just pretty much read that passage as is in the film version that came out. I think it came out in 1984, that version. I think they just let it ride with that passage. Was somebody going to say something?
I was just going to say, just going back again, it's just all in the language, just to know that a lot of these words were created to deceive and things like that. And while I was saying that, I was thinking of the whole word minority and how basically just that word, it sort of gives you it sort of makes you feel inferior just hearing that you're the minority. And it's like non-whites in America, they really feel like we are the minority, not just in America, but globally. And, of course, that's so not true. So it's just like, yeah, just back to the language, the whole use of certain words.
Well, when you listen to the term minority, you look at the root word, minor. When a person is a minor, that means that they are not an adult, that they are in need of supervision. So when non-white people label or accept or embrace terminology that they are minorities, what they are essentially saying or conceding is that these individuals are supposed to be rightfully in positions of supervision of them, that they are the adults, and that we should accept our childlike status without ever trying to question those who have majority governorship over our lives.
It seems to me like it ends up being so well broken down and dispersed into like in that it's just wordplay, so it seeps into your mind, and then you kind of just with the words themselves become the agent that's making everything manifest as white supremacy. So it's like they can talk about us and not even be talking about us. So like I appreciate Context of White Supremacy. We're talking about white supremacy, so we're not really talking about. We established that's what we're talking about. So then, when they're ignoring us, that becomes evident, or just when it's like there's no mention of black people in the story, but it's white supremacy at the same time. So I just find that interesting, the way like they don't have to. It's like just the fact of being overlooked is the main, like what the thing that's being overlooked is like the most important thing. Like I don't know, it's very confusing, but just the absent narrative, I think it's kind of, I've heard it kind of the way whiteness kind of white people end up being invisible in white supremacy.
This 0128. Hang on one second.
Yep.
0128. Did you have something you wanted to share?
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to share my experience with reading 1984. I read that in high school, and that the only thing I remember I came away with was that propaganda is very powerful, you know, and I think that, you know, with the story that was being told in that book, you know, the way they had, you know, control of the people there, it was all through propaganda. So I just think that that propaganda is very powerful.
Klondike Mike.
Hey, I just wanted to say I completely agree with Brooklyn caller, and it's amazing because everything, it's like every single thing that is said has a context of its own. So within a conversation, there are so many other different subplots, like almost, and it manipulates your emotions, and there are things that are being said that are unsaid, and it's crazy.
To mention on the propaganda piece that one of the callers mentioned, propaganda it's very true. It's a very true thing that has happened because, as you said, as we all looking back in history with what happened with the Germans and on Goebbels and what he did with the propaganda piece in order to demonize a specific ethnic group of people, the so-called European Jews, as being the enemy. And we are seeing the same thing that are being done now with the propaganda in the media to say that, okay, something is wrong with black people. They're criminal by nature. They're born criminals. They need to be locked away. They're diseased people. Look at them. They're out here. They're the reason that our numbers, the CDC is saying that so many things are wrong with them, that they have all of these issues with them. So we are seeing where this propaganda is being built up to put us in a position to be exterminated, because I can see this stuff is coming down the pike. Because even so-called black people are looking at one another in this way to say that, yes, there's something wrong with some of us. That I'm even hearing people saying that, yes, bring in the National Guard because we want to have these white people patrolling the streets because black people can't control themselves. They're shooting up at each other. They're killing each other. We need the white people to send in the National Guard, as if though we don't already have problems with white law enforcement patrolling the streets. Look at what happened in Cleveland with those two black people that were gunned down 137 times, that they fired bullets to kill two black people. So we are letting ourselves, by this propaganda being put out here, this crime stats that are going to be running in the news, for us to call in for the National Guard and all kinds of law enforcement to come in and put us under martial law.
Well, you know, with the individuals that were gunned down and 130-something bullets, there was no national outrage, no president, and he is a victim, on television crying about such a horrendous crime. And these children and these teachers were killed in Connecticut today, and now it's a national outrage. Everyone wants to now have the gun control conversation all of a sudden again. And I think that it's rather ironic that when certain incidents happen, there's this outrage and so forth, but we've become so desensitized to victims being shot, being killed, and so often most of us bookend our days with, we wake up in the morning and we hear about a recap of some tragic thing that supposedly occurred in a neighborhood which is filled with victims, and when we close our eyes at night, we go to sleep to images of seeing victims carried, out to the precinct, usually with a hood over their head. They're usually leading with the story talking about these individuals perpetrated this crime and did that crime, and it's disproportionate that you hear about crimes and the crimes that you hear about or what they classify as crimes is predominantly victims. But as you become less confused, and I mean, I don't know if this is true of other people, but there are times when I can listen to a news account or read something, and I can immediately spot whether they're talking about a non-black person, a non-white person, or they're talking about a white person. For this incident from today, when I heard the initial news accounts, I immediately knew that the one who was supposed to be the shooter was a white person, just by the way in which they talked about him.
Agree.
I feel like they purposely didn't even tell what he was. They were just like, oh, he's in his 20s and blah, blah, blah. But if it had been a non-white person, they'd be quick to release that information. But
when they said where this incident took place and the number of people, I knew immediately it had to be a white person. And they said his mother was one of the victims that he killed, and on another family member, adult family member, that was killed in another location. I knew it was a white person. Black people kill unless it's something it's race related, like Omar Thornton. I believe that was also in Connecticut, who was victimized on the job, and he decided to take it to the workplace and kill those white people on the job. But very seldom would you find a black person would go into a school and just kill that many people. So I knew immediately it was a white person. But you saw the sympathy angle, how they're doing it. They're creating mental issues, saying, okay, there's something mentally deficient about him, why he did this killing. And they're working a sympathy angle for this white person, even though he did all of this, killed over 28 people, including himself. But if it's a black person, they're a terrorist, they're a murderer, there's something wrong with them. We need to get the chair out immediately and strap them into it and get them out of here. This is what they say with black people. Now everybody want to have a national day of prayer. The president have the flags flying at half-staff around the country because some white people got killed. What about all those people in Chicago, his home state? All those black people that were killed in that area. No mention of them.
System of white supremacy. Yeah, that's. I can see the anti-blackness is going to ride. I'm looking at the CNN front page, and I think someone had emailed me about President Obama being on TV crying about this incident. I can see that's going to. I said that next 4 years that anti-blackness is going to rise. You just pay attention to the way black people talk about President Obama over to the way we talk about, treat black people on the whole. I suspect could be wrong. This has nothing to do with 1984 directly. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm sure we can spend some time chatting about all of this, what happened up there, and all that good stuff. Hope the broadcast was constructive. We'll be back 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, next Friday. I thought the romance thing with the female of interest, that the main character, Winston, that he is attracted to, I thought she was going to pop back in this week, but I think I got a little bit ahead of where we were leaving off at this week. So, and again, we're not very far. We're not even halfway through the book yet, so most of the book is yet to come. Their love interest is going to become a more dominant aspect of the book as we continue. So the white man, white woman dynamic will become a greater part of what we're talking about. People have been talking about the Urugu and the anti-female energy. We will be back tomorrow. Compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Dial in if you have thoughts you'd like to share. I'm sure the Connecticut issue. Now we will have lots of things to talk about, which I think is typically the case, which should not be on Area 8. Whoopee! We should have programs, I think, every day for like the next week, uninterrupted, white people permitting, and if all of the guests follow through on their commitments. So just stay tuned. We should be on every day. every day for the next week and change during the holiday silliness, madness, confusion. Cal should be there to help you keep some sanity and focus on the plantation. Does anybody want to do the prayer to wrap things up?
I could give it a go.
Outstanding. Gave S. a rest for the day. Again, we'll be back tomorrow evening, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. And best if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. PayPal button. Top of the page, invest if you think the program is constructive. I do want to read that passage really quick before we pass off to our Brooklyn caller to wrap things up, just because I think it is the most poignant moment in 1984. Just make it obvious, clear, make it plain. I think that's the Malcolm X documentary, which is outstanding, PBS documentary on his life and times. Make it plain. I understand how. I do not understand why. He wondered, as he had many times wondered before, whether he himself was a lunatic. Perhaps a lunatic was simply a minority of one. At one time, it had been a sign of madness to believe that the earth goes around the sun. Today, to believe that the past is inalterable. He might be alone in holding that belief, and if alone, then a lunatic. But the thought of being a lunatic did not greatly trouble him. The horror was that he might also be wrong. He picked up the children's book, the children's history book, and looked at the portrait of Big Brother, which formed its frontispiece. The hypnotic eyes gazed into his own. It was as though some huge force were pressing down upon you, something that penetrated inside your skull, battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense. And what was terrifying was not that they would kill you for thinking otherwise, but that they might be right. For after all, how do we know that 2 and 2 make 4, or that the force of gravity works, or that the past is unchangeable, if both the past and the external world exist only in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? Great passage. He just ends it simply. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 makes 4. If that is granted, all else follows. Truth. Before I pass to our Brooklyn caller to conclude things, Jenks Morton was mentioned. He was a guest on the program, summer of 2010, giving out some of the information that S. touched on. One of the other statistics that he brought up, the statistic or the belief that hordes of black males are sexually involved with white women. He felt that was another piece of information that is being falsely promoted. And unfortunately, many victims have picked that up and ran with it. Talked about that on the program, Jenks Morton, back in 2010. You can check the archives, Context of White Supremacy. Caller in Brooklyn, take it away.
All right, thanks. Creator, please assist us to use our words in the most effective way to bring about justice in our actions and in the actions of all the people around us, so that we can bring about justice ultimately everywhere. And end the system of racism and white supremacy.
Ashe. Context of White Supremacy. Signing out. Thank you all for tuning in.
Damn you, Obama.